Hello everyone, I'm here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Clara Jacobs had always been a dreamer. Not the kind that floated through life, chasing impossible fantasies, but the kind whose mind churned relentlessly, never stopping, always moving. It was a curse she had inherited from her mother. She suspected this restless mind that never shut down, always running even when the world around her was quiet. It was in her blood, that constant hum of anxiety, the slow burn of fear that lurked beneath every thought. But it wasn't just the waking world that troubled Clara. It was the dreams, the nightmares, that had plagued her for as long as she could remember. It was the same nightmare every time, a twisted version of her childhood home, darkened by something evil that seemed to whisper her name, calling her deeper into the shadows. There were always creatures, horrible things, with teeth too sharp and eyes that glowed like embers in the dark. They would chase her, clawing at her skin, their breath hot against her neck. And no matter how fast she ran, no matter how far she tried to escape, they always caught up to her. And then she woke up. Except, it wasn't always the same. Some nights, when she opened her eyes, Clara would find a shadow in the corner of her room, lurking just beyond the edge of the lamplight. She would blink and it would disappear, but the feeling would remain, the suffocating presence of something just out of reach, something watching her, waiting for her to sleep again. She had grown used to it, the shadows that clung to her every moment, the whispers in the dark that refused to quiet. It wasn't real, she'd tell herself over and over. It was just the aftermath of a bad dream, the consequences of a mind too tired to rest. But tonight, something felt different. Clara awoke with a start, gasping for air, her heart pounding in her chest. She could still hear the faint echoes of the nightmare in her mind, the sound of footsteps in the dark, the sharp scrape of claws against the floor. She wiped her damp palms against the sheets, the reality of the dream still clinging to her skin. For a long moment, she lay in the darkness, her eyes fixed on the corner of her bedroom where the shadows stretched impossibly long. Something shifted there. Her breath caught in her throat. Clara sat up slowly, her senses on high alert, but when she blinked, the corner of the room was empty. The shadows had returned to their normal form, stretching lazily along the walls, as they always did. She let out a shaky breath and cursed herself. She was exhausted. She'd been working too many late nights, pushing herself too hard with the new freelance project she had taken on. Maybe it was time for a break. But that feeling, the cold, creeping sensation of being watched, didn't fade. Clara pulled the covers tightly around her shoulders, trying to shake off the sense of unease. The night was still, almost too still. Outside, the wind had died down, and the usual hum of the city had fallen quiet, leaving only the sound of her own breathing and the occasional rustle of the trees outside. The silence was deafening, and it set her on edge. She glanced at the clock, 3:02 a.m. She couldn't go back to sleep. Not yet. She needed to calm her racing heart, needed to convince herself that it was just a nightmare, just the brain's way of processing stress. Clara swung her legs out of bed and stood, her bare feet touching the cool wooden floor. She padded quietly across the room to her desk, reaching for her journal. Writing always helped. It grounded her. Maybe she could jot down some thoughts, distract herself for a little while. She flipped open the journal and began to write, the familiar scratch of the pen calming her nerves as she poured her thoughts onto the paper. It was a release, a way to let the chaos of her mind out. As she wrote, the shadows in the room seemed to fade and the tension in her chest eased. But then she froze. From the corner of her eye, she saw something move. Just a flicker, a shadow, no larger than a passing cloud, darted across the floor, its shape indistinguishable, like a distortion in the air. Clara's breath hitched. No, she thought. No, it can't be real. It's just your mind playing tricks. But the air felt colder now, too cold for a spring night. And there it was again, a scrape like nails on wood, coming from the far corner of the room. Her heart thudded in her chest as she slowly turned her head, but the room was still as silent as before. The clock's tick was louder now, almost mocking her. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for anything that could explain what she'd just seen. Nothing. Her hands were shaking. This wasn't just a bad dream. This wasn't her mind. Something was wrong. Then something else. A soft whisper, so faint she almost thought she imagined it. Clara. She whipped around, her eyes scanning the room again. Her body tensed, ready to run, to scream, to do anything to break the suffocating silence. But again, nothing. Her breath was coming in short gasps now, her hands trembling as she set the journal down and backed away from her desk. She turned toward the door, intending to leave the room, to escape the cold, heavy feeling that was slowly suffocating her. That's when she saw it. Standing just beyond the door, in the dim hallway light, was a figure. A shadow, and it was not a trick of the light. Its eyes glowed, red and hungry, and Clara's heart stopped in her chest. The creature, if it could even be called that, was vaguely human in shape, but twisted. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, with veins running across it like black rivers. It stood motionless, its grotesque mouth stretching into a wide, unnatural grin. Clara took a step back, her heart racing. She couldn't move. Her body was frozen, trapped in the terror of what she was seeing. Was this the nightmare? Had it somehow come to life? The figure stepped forward, its foot scraping against the floor, sending a chill down Clara's spine. Clara! The whisper was louder this time, almost a growl, and it echoed in her mind like a sickening chant. She turned and ran, not stopping, not daring to look back as the sound of its footsteps followed her. The nightmare was no longer just in her mind. It was alive. Clara stumbled through the dark hallway, her pulse racing, her mind trying to catch up with the panic that had overtaken her body. The soft padding of her feet against the wooden floors was the only sound in the otherwise silent apartment. But in her mind, the echo of those whispers, Clara, clung to her every thought, twisting and coiling like a snake. She dared not look back. She had already seen enough. That thing, whatever it was, had been real. More real than any nightmare she had ever experienced. And it had been waiting for her, lurking just beyond the threshold of her room. The living nightmare. Her hand grazed the wall as she ran, her eyes flitting over the dim, empty space around her. She could hear nothing but the thundering of her own heartbeat in her ears, drowning out the outside world. She reached the front door, her fingers fumbling with the lock, her breath coming in desperate gasps. Focus, Clara, she told herself, trying to steady her trembling hands. You have to get out. The door clicked open, but as she stepped forward into the hallway outside her apartment, the hairs on her neck stood up. She had seen the creature so clearly, its glowing eyes, its wide, gaping mouth. It had been right there in her room, right there in her world. How had it crossed over? With one last look over her shoulder, she slammed the door shut behind her, the sound of it locking echoing in the hall. She backed up slowly, eyes scanning every shadowed corner, every darkened doorway. She felt something cold creep along her skin, crawling under her clothes like an icy breath on her neck. And then the sound came again, a soft scrape like nails dragging across wood. Clara's head snapped toward the source of the noise. She couldn't see anything in the dark corridor, just the distant hum of the building's ancient plumbing, the faint rustle of the wind outside. But she felt it deep in her chest, a presence. Something was there. No, no, no. Her breath hitched, the panic building in her chest. Hello, she called out shakily, her voice barely above a whisper, but it felt like the words were the only thing anchoring her to reality. Is anyone there? No answer. Then, from somewhere deep within the building, a door creaked open. The sound was so faint, so far away, but it felt close to Clara, as though it was right behind her, whispering her name. Clara. Her blood ran cold. Suddenly, she turned on her heel and sprinted down the hallway, her feet pounding against the floor, each step an explosion of adrenaline and terror. She barely registered the other apartments as she passed them, too afraid to look inside, too afraid of what she might see. She didn't know where she was going, just away from the nightmare, away from that thing that had come to life. She couldn't go back to her apartment, not with whatever that thing was out there. Clara rushed down the staircase, skipping 2 steps at a time, her heart hammering in her chest. She didn't stop until she burst out into the cool night air. The city was quiet, eerily so, the only sound the distant hum of traffic and the occasional car passing by. She wasn't sure where to go. She didn't have anyone she could turn to. Not in the city, not now. Her mother had disappeared years ago, and her father. Well, he had never believed her when she was a child, not when the nightmares first started. What could she possibly say to him now? Clara's mind raced. What is happening to me? She didn't have an answer. She didn't have time to think it through. Her breath was coming in ragged gasps, and she clutched her arms tightly to her sides as if that might somehow stop the cold, the terror, from creeping under her skin. She needed answers. She needed to understand how her nightmares had crossed over. She needed to know why. The next few hours were a blur. Clara didn't know where she went or what she did, but eventually, exhaustion overtook her, and she found herself at a small cafe on the corner of a quiet street. It was the only place still open at this hour, a refuge from the cold and the terror that had followed her. She sat in a corner booth, nursing a cup of coffee, though she couldn't really taste it. Her mind was still reeling from what she had seen, what she had felt, the creature in her apartment, the way it had moved, how real it had been. She had to be losing her mind, right? But no, she knew better. It wasn't just in her head. Whatever it was had crossed over from her dreams into her waking world. That wasn't something a person just imagined. Her fingers trembled around the mug. The cafe was empty, save for the sleepy-eyed barista behind the counter. She tried to focus on the comforting hum of the coffee machine, the faint clink of a spoon against ceramic, but it didn't ease the growing dread in her chest. No, it was only getting worse. She had to do something. Clara wasn't sure what she was looking for when she took out her phone, but she felt compelled to search. She typed in a quick query, nightmare creatures crossing into reality. It was a long shot, but she needed to know if anyone else had experienced this. Her thumb hesitated over the screen as the search results loaded. But as she read through the articles, her heart began to race once more. There were stories, old ones, folklore, and obscure. Accounts of people who had experienced something similar, living nightmares. Night terrors that bled into the waking world. But no answers, no explanations. She continued reading, one article after another, until one caught her eye. The Curse of the Dreamer, How the Living Nightmares Are Born. Clara's stomach twisted. She clicked the link. It was a short, cryptic post detailing the origins of a legend, one that spoke of people who had suffered immense trauma or fear, people whose nightmares grew so intense, so vivid, that they took on a life of their own. They weren't just dreams. They were creatures, born from the depths of the mind, capable of crossing over into reality. And once they were released, they were unstoppable. They fed on fear, growing stronger the more terror they caused. Her hands shook as she read. The description of these nightmares fit too closely with what Clara had seen. The glowing eyes, the twisted forms, the relentless pursuit. But the post ended with a chilling line. Once the nightmares are free, there is only one way to stop them. Destroy the dreamer's source of fear before it consumes them both. Clara's breath caught in her throat. Destroy the source of fear? Her thoughts scrambled, trying to connect the dots. What was it that she feared? The nightmares had always been part of her, ever since she was a child. But was there something more? Something deeper? Something from her past? Her hand clenched into a fist, the mug rattling on the table. She was no closer to understanding, but one thing was certain. Whatever had begun, whatever had crossed over, she couldn't run from it anymore. The nightmares were real, and they were coming for her. Clara stared at her phone screen, the words blurring together as her mind raced. The room seemed to spin as the weight of the post settled over her. Destroy the source of fear. It sounded absurd, like something out of a bad horror movie. But deep down, Clara knew it wasn't just a warning. It was a truth that she had to face, whether she was ready for it or not. The creature in her apartment had been real. It had crossed over from her nightmare into the waking world, just like the post had described. And if the legend was right, then it was just the beginning. She closed her eyes, her breath shallow, trying to steady herself. Her mind flashed back to the nightmare, to the creature with its glowing eyes and gaping mouth. The terror that had gripped her was still fresh, the feeling of being hunted still lingering. And somewhere in the back of her mind, she knew that it wasn't just the creature she had to fear. It was the reason they existed in the first place. Her past. Clara rubbed her temples, trying to force herself to think clearly. The post had said that the nightmares were born from unresolved trauma. That meant there was something deep inside her, some hidden fear or pain that had given life to these creatures. But what? She had never fully understood the origins of her nightmares, only that they had started when she was a child, after her parents' divorce. No, she thought, shaking her head. It's more than that. There's something deeper, something I've buried. The cafe seemed to close in around her. The faint hum of the barista's movements, the clink of silverware, it all faded into the background as her mind pulled her back to her childhood home. She could see it clearly in her mind's eye, though she hadn't stepped foot in the house in years. The old, creaky floors. The hallway that always seemed darker than it should be. Her mother, always distant, always tired. And her father, his face twisted in anger, his voice raised, harsh, unforgiving. There had been so many nights like that. So many fights. So many things she couldn't understand as a child. But there was one night she would never forget. Clara's breath hitched as the memory came crashing back. Her father's face, red with fury, his voice echoing through the house. Her mother had been crying, pleading for him to stop. Clara, too young to understand the full weight of what was happening, had hidden in the closet, listening as the shouting escalated. Then there was the sound of shattering glass, a loud crash, and everything had gone quiet. Clara had stayed there, trembling in the dark, too scared to move, too scared to make a sound. When she'd finally come out of the closet, her father was gone. Her mother was sitting on the floor, her face pale and tear-streaked. And nothing was the same after that. It wasn't just the divorce, Clara realized now, her heart pounding. It was that night. That was the moment everything had changed. That was the night the nightmares had begun. Clara's throat tightened, and she fought back the tears that threatened to spill. She had never allowed herself to think about it this way. She had buried it, locked it away so deep that she had forgotten the full extent of the terror she'd felt. But the nightmares had never forgotten. They had fed on that fear, on that helplessness. They had been born from the pain, the confusion, the trauma that had shaped her life ever since. And now, they were alive. She placed her phone on the table, her hands trembling. The barista behind the counter glanced over at her, but Clara couldn't bring herself to meet his gaze. She stood up, the room spinning slightly as she walked toward the door. There was only one place she could go now, back to that house. Back to where it all started. She had to face it, whatever it was, if she wanted to stop the nightmares. But as she stepped out into the night, the realization hit her with full force. It wasn't just the nightmares that were waiting for her. It was the past. She couldn't run anymore. The streets were quiet as Clara walked, the cold air biting at her skin. Her apartment felt like a distant memory now, an uncomfortable reminder of the terror that had taken root there. The more she thought about it, the more it seemed impossible to believe that she had been living in that space, unaware of the horrors lurking beneath the surface. As she approached the familiar intersection that led to her childhood neighborhood, Clara felt a strange sense of foreboding. She hadn't seen the house in years, not since her mother moved away after her father's death. Her mother had never spoken about the divorce, or the night that had changed everything. Clara had always wondered why, but she had never pressed. Maybe she had been afraid of what the truth would reveal. The house was just a few blocks away now. Clara's steps quickened, her thoughts racing. She didn't know what she expected to find there, whether the house would even still be standing, or whether the memories it held would have been erased by time. But she couldn't ignore the pull anymore. The nightmares were waiting for her, and if there was any hope of ending them, she had to return to the source. She rounded the corner, and there it was, looming in the distance. Her childhood home. It looked the same, run down, worn with age. The paint on the windows was chipped, the roof sagging in places. But it was still standing. And as Clara stood there, staring up at it, she felt a wave of nausea wash over her. This was where it had all begun. She hesitated at the edge of the driveway, her mind racing. She wasn't sure what she was expecting. She wasn't even sure what she was hoping for. But she couldn't back down now. The nightmares were real, and they wouldn't stop until she faced the truth. Taking a deep breath, Clara crossed the yard and walked toward the front door. The creaking sound of the porch steps beneath her feet made her pause, a chill creeping up her spine. She pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest as she stepped inside. The air was musty, stale, the house abandoned for years. The living room was exactly as she remembered it. The old couch, the worn rug, the pictures of her family on the walls. But there was something else, something darker. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch longer, the air thick with the weight of memories. Clara moved deeper into the house, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She could feel the presence of something, an energy in the air, something that had never truly left this place. It was here, in this very house, that the nightmares had been born. And Clara knew, deep down, that the only way to stop them was to confront what had happened that night. But the question remained. What had happened? What had she been running from all these years? Clara walked slowly to the staircase, the sound of her breath filling the empty space around her. She couldn't run anymore. It was time to face what had been haunting her, both the nightmares and the past. The truth was waiting. Clara's heart pounded in her chest as she ascended the staircase, each step creaking beneath her weight, as though the house itself were protesting her presence. The air grew colder with each passing moment, and her breath came in shallow bursts. The familiar darkness of the hallway at the top of the stairs stretched before her like a living thing, its oppressive silence swallowing any remnants of comfort the house might have once held. She reached the landing and paused, her eyes tracing the narrow hall that led to the bedrooms. The faint smell of dust and neglect filled the air, mingling with something else, something sour that tugged at her memory. She shuddered and pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders. This was it, the room at the end of the hall. As a child, Clara had never ventured near that room, her father's study, as her mother called it. That was where the arguments had always reached their breaking point, where her father's anger had been at its sharpest. It was also where the final moment of her childhood had shattered. That night, that unbearable night, she had hidden in the dark of the closet, too terrified to make a sound, and when she finally emerged, everything had changed. Her father had been gone, her mother had been broken, and Clara had never been the same. Her steps felt heavier now, her pulse quickening with every inch she moved toward that door. She could almost feel the weight of her younger self, so small, so frightened, standing just behind her, afraid to approach, afraid to face the truth. But that was the child she used to be. She had to face the adult she had become. The door to the study loomed before her now, a dark wooden rectangle at the end of the hall, its handle cold and unyielding as she reached for it. For a moment, Clara hesitated. She had no idea what she might find inside. Would it be a relic of her past? Or would it hold something far worse? Something from the nightmares that had followed her into the waking world? You have to go in, she told herself, voice trembling. You can't run anymore. She twisted the knob and pushed the door open. A rush of stale air greeted her, thick with dust and the smell of old books. The room was dim, lit only by the pale moonlight filtering through the dusty windows. The walls were lined with bookshelves, sagging under the weight of countless volumes, their spines cracked and faded. The desk in the center of the room was covered in a layer of dust so thick it looked as though no one had touched it in years. But it wasn't the dust that made Clara's stomach churn. It was the feeling. The room felt wrong, as though something in it had never truly left, as though the anger and pain that had soaked the walls all those years ago were still alive, still pulsing beneath the surface. Her eyes moved slowly around the room, taking in the familiar sights, the old armchair in the corner, the broken clock on the wall, the stacks of papers scattered across the desk. But it was the farthest corner of the room that drew her gaze. There, in the shadowed corner, stood an old wooden chest. It was small, inconspicuous, but something about it called to Clara. It was the one thing in the room that she hadn't remembered from her childhood, and yet it felt strangely familiar. Clara's breath caught in her throat. The chest. It was the thing her father had kept locked. She had never known what was inside, and when he had left, it had been left untouched, its key gone with him. This is it, she thought, her heart racing in her chest. This is the source of it all. The nightmares. The creature. Everything had come from this place, this room, this chest. Clara took a step toward it, her legs shaky beneath her. Her eyes locked onto the chest, and for a moment, she felt as though she were no longer in control of her own body. Something else was guiding her, pulling her forward, urging her to open it, to confront whatever had been hidden inside all these years. She reached for the lid, her fingers trembling as they brushed the cold wood. And then a voice. Clara. It was faint, a whisper on the edge of her consciousness. But she recognized it immediately. It was the same voice she had heard that night in her apartment in the nightmare. She froze. No. But the whisper grew louder, more insistent. Clara, open it. The voice was no longer just in her head. It was real, coming from somewhere in the room, from the chest. Her hands gripped the lid, her knuckles white. She didn't want to do it. She didn't want to face whatever was inside. But she knew she had no choice. With one final breath, she lifted the lid. Inside the chest was a tattered, old leather-bound book. The pages were yellowed with age, the cover cracked and worn. The book seemed so out of place in the chest, too delicate, too fragile for something so buried, so hidden. But Clara didn't have to open it to know what it was. This was the source of her nightmares. The thing that had called the creature from her dreams into reality. The book wasn't just a book, it was a doorway. The moment her fingers touched it, the room seemed to shift. The walls groaned, the air thickened, and the shadows in the corners began to writhe. Clara pulled her hand back quickly, but the damage was already done. It knows I'm here, she thought, a sickening realization sinking in. It's awake. The air grew heavy around her, the temperature dropping, the shadows stretching toward her. She could hear whispers again, louder now, more frantic. Clara. Her heart hammered in her chest. She didn't know what was happening, only that she had made a terrible mistake by opening the chest, by touching the book. And now the nightmares were no longer confined to the realm of dreams. They had crossed over, and they were coming for her. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang, locking her inside the study. Clara spun around, her breath coming in gasps, her mind racing. From the darkness, she saw it. The creature, the same one from her nightmares. It stood in the doorway, its glowing eyes fixed on her, its body twisted and contorted, a grotesque mockery of a human form. The air around it shimmered with malice, its presence suffocating and unnatural. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she backed away, but the creature stepped forward, blocking the door. Its smile stretched wide, impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. You can never escape, it whispered, its voice an unearthly rasp. You opened the door, Clara. You summoned me. The shadows seemed to close in around her, and Clara realized with a growing sense of horror that she had just unleashed something far worse than her nightmares. She had opened the door to something ancient, something that had been waiting in the dark corners of her mind for years. The creature stepped forward again, its form flickering like a mirage, becoming more solid with each passing second. And Clara knew, with sickening certainty, that she was not going to make it out alive. Clara's heart thudded in her chest, panic rising within her like a tidal wave. Her instinct screamed at her to run, but the creature, its unblinking eyes glowing with malice, blocked every escape. The room felt smaller, suffocating. The walls pressed in, pulsing with an unseen energy, as though the very house itself was alive, feeding off her terror. She thought, her breath coming in ragged gasps. I won't let it end like this. Her hand found the edge of the desk, her fingers trembling as she tried to steady herself. The air around the creature seemed to crackle, thick and oppressive, but Clara's eyes never left it. Every inch of her body screamed to flee, but she knew that running would be futile. This thing, whatever it was, wasn't bound by the laws of the physical world. It existed in a space that bled into her reality, a space that had been opened when she touched that cursed book. Her gaze darted toward the open chest. The book still sat there, its pages inviting her with an almost hypnotic pull. It wants me to take it, Clara realized. It wants me to read it. The creature moved again, its form slithering closer, its grotesque limbs extending unnaturally. It smiled, that awful, teeth-baring grin, as if it could taste her fear. Clara's mind scrambled for a solution, but nothing came to her. This wasn't just a nightmare, this was real. And there was only one thing she knew for certain. If she didn't act fast, the thing in front of her was going to tear her apart. Wait, the post. It said something about confronting the source of fear. The words echoed in her mind, like a distant memory. The nightmares, the creature, everything, it had to be connected to that trauma she had buried so long ago. The source wasn't just the book or the creature. It was her fear, her pain, the unresolved darkness of her past. But how could she face that? How could she confront something that had stayed buried for so long? As if in response to her question, the creature hissed, a low, guttural sound that vibrated through the floorboards. It was as if it had heard her thoughts and was now pushing her further into the corner. Clara closed her eyes, willing herself to think. The room was suffocating, the shadows closing in. The whispers were back, swirling around her, growing louder, echoing in her ears. The memories she had tried so hard to forget began to surface. The sound of her father's angry voice, the feeling of being trapped, of having no escape. She had never truly faced that moment, never allowed herself to understand what had happened, what it had done to her. No more running, she thought. No more hiding. She took a deep breath and, with trembling hands, grabbed the book from the chest. The moment her fingers touched it, the world around her seemed to freeze. The creature's movement slowed, its eerie grin widening, as if it too was waiting for her to make her next move. Clara held the book in her hands, her pulse racing. She could feel the weight of it, as if the pages themselves were pulsing with energy, with power. There was a dread inside her, something ancient and primal that screamed for her to stop, to throw the book down and run. But this was the key. This was the only way. With a trembling hand, Clara opened the book. The words on the pages seemed to twist and writhe, their ink shifting as though alive, as though they were watching her. She read the first line aloud, her voice breaking the silence like a crack of thunder. The darkness comes from within. It is fed by what you fear most. Only by facing what you have buried can you banish it. Clara's throat tightened. The truth hit her like a punch to the gut. It was her fear that had fed the creature. The shadows in the room deepened, and the creature's form flickered, its distorted body beginning to pulse with a sickly, unnatural light. The more Clara read, the more the creature writhed, as though in agony. She continued, her voice growing stronger. Fear is a reflection of what we cannot face, and it lives in the hearts of those who dare not confront it. But there is a way. The source must be seen, understood, and released. As she read the final words, Clara's mind exploded with memories. The night of the fight, her father's face twisted in rage, her mother crying on the floor, her own small hands trembling as she listened to the violence from behind the closet door, the shattering of glass, the silence that followed, the darkness that had swallowed her childhood, leaving only scars. This is it, Clara realized. This is the moment I was never allowed to face. The creature screeched, its form warping as if it were unraveling before her eyes. The walls seemed to tremble, and the shadows, those deep, ancient shadows, began to tear apart. Clara closed her eyes and let herself feel it all. The pain, the fear, the anger, all of it. She allowed herself to remember the helplessness, the terror she had never been able to voice, the fear that had lived inside her for so long. "I forgive you," she whispered to the darkness. "I forgive you, Dad." As soon as the words left her lips, the creature let out a horrific scream, its form disintegrating into the air. The room shook violently, the book glowing with a blinding light. Clara fell to her knees, her hands trembling as the light enveloped her. It was as though the very foundation of the house was breaking apart, the darkness being washed away, its grip on her life severed once and for all. The whispers grew louder, then suddenly stopped. Clara opened her eyes. The room was still. The shadows had disappeared. The creature was gone. And for the first time in years, Clara felt the weight in her chest, the weight of the past, begin to lift. She stood shakily, the book still in her hands. The air was calm now, the oppressive weight gone. The house, which had once felt alive with fear, now felt strangely empty. The energy that had pulsed through the walls had dissipated, leaving only silence. "It's over." Clara closed the book and placed it back into the chest. She took one last look around the room, a feeling of closure settling in her heart. The house had been the birthplace of her nightmares, but it was also where she had finally faced the truth. The truth about her father, her past, and the fear that had shaped her. And now, she was free. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of Clara's apartment, casting a warm, golden glow over the room. It felt different, softer. The air no longer felt heavy, suffocating as it had before. Clara took a deep breath and exhaled slowly, feeling lighter than she had in years. She no longer felt the shadow of the nightmares looming over her. They had vanished, not just from her dreams, but from her life. Though the past would always be a part of her, Clara knew she could move forward. She could live without fear. For the first time in a long time, she smiled. It wasn't over. It was just the beginning. Clara stood at her window, watching as the city slowly came to life beneath the soft golden hues of the morning. The nightmare was over, or so she thought. It had felt like a new beginning, like she had broken free from the chains that had kept her bound for so many years. Yet, something lingered in the air, an unease she couldn't shake. The book, the chest, the study. The more Clara thought about it, the more she realized that she hadn't destroyed the source of her terror. She had simply closed the door on it, tucked it away in that forsaken room, believing that by facing her fears, she had overcome them. But what if she hadn't? What if the nightmares weren't just a manifestation of her past, but a living, breathing thing? She walked to her desk and pulled the drawer open, her fingers brushing against the smooth surface of a letter that had arrived earlier that week. The return address was unfamiliar, and she had been too distracted to open it until now. Her name was printed neatly on the envelope, the ink crisp, but it was the postmark that sent a chill running down her spine. It was from the town she had left behind, the place that had been a part of her past, the place where everything had started. Impossible, Clara thought, her hand shaking as she tore open the envelope. She scanned the letter, her eyes widening as she read the words aloud in a whisper. "Clara, we need your help. The nightmares have returned, and we don't know what to do. It's just like before. It's happening again. The book is gone. The chest was emptied. But something has stirred. Something ancient." Clara's blood ran cold. The letter fell from her hands as she stood frozen. The reality of what she had hoped was overcoming crashing down on her. The creature, the darkness that had plagued her, hadn't been destroyed after all. It was still out there, and it was calling her back. A surge of fear, a feeling she thought she had conquered, rose inside her once again. This wasn't just a dream. This was real. The nightmares weren't done with her. They had only been lying dormant, waiting for the right moment to come back to life. She had thought she was free, but she wasn't. And now she had to go back. Clara didn't hesitate. The choice was clear. The nightmare was not something that could be escaped. It was something that had burrowed deep into the fabric of her past. It was time to confront it once again, before it could destroy everything she cared about. She packed a small bag, her hands steady despite the storm of thoughts racing through her mind. She hadn't realized it before, but the truth was undeniable now. This place, the town of Dark Hollow, was tied to her very soul. It was a place of twisted memories, a place where every shadow had a story, where every corner hid a secret. As Clara pulled her coat tightly around her, she stood before the mirror, gazing at her reflection. It was time to finish this. The drive back to Dark Hollow was long and grueling. The roads wound through dense forests that seemed to stretch on forever, the trees tall and looming like silent sentinels. The air grew colder the closer she got to her destination, the sense of dread settling heavily over her once again. As she approached the town, the feeling of unease thickened. The houses were old and decaying, the streets eerily quiet as though everyone had retreated inside, leaving only shadows in their wake. Clara's heart pounded as she turned onto the familiar street that led to her childhood home. The house stood at the end of the road, its silhouette dark against the starless sky. It looked the same, unchanged, but Clara knew that nothing could ever be the same again. She parked the car and sat for a moment, staring at the house. The door to the study, the room where everything had started, was locked, but she could still feel it, the pulse of malevolent energy that emanated from within. It had been waiting for her. It was never gone. Taking a deep breath, Clara stepped out of the car and walked toward the front door. The sound of her footsteps echoed in the night, as though the very ground was watching her, waiting. When she reached the door, it creaked open as if expecting her. She stepped inside. The silence was suffocating. The house felt colder than before. The air was thick with an unseen presence, heavy and oppressive. Every step Clara took seemed to make the darkness grow thicker, like it was closing in on her, suffocating her from all sides. The study door stood at the end of the hallway, just as it had years ago. Clara walked toward it, her breath shallow, every instinct screaming at her to turn around, to run far away from this place. But she had no choice. She had come this far. She had to finish this. The door opened with a soft groan, revealing the study bathed in shadow. The chest was there, as she remembered it, silent still, but somehow more sinister now. Clara felt a tug in her chest, a pull that she couldn't explain, as if the chest were calling to her. But she couldn't open it, not yet. The answer wasn't in the chest, but in the shadows, in the source of everything that had tormented her. With trembling hands, Clara reached for the book. It was still there, its pages untouched, its ancient cover waiting. Her fingers brushed against the leather, and she felt it again, the pull. The sense that something ancient was stirring. Something dark, something alive. The nightmares were just a part of it. The source is here. And just as Clara was about to open the book again, the air in the room shifted. A whisper. "Clara." It was faint at first, like a breeze in the distance, but it grew louder, more distinct. "Clara, you can't run from me." The voice sent a chill through Clara's spine. It was no longer the soft, pleading whisper of the creature she had once known. It was stronger now, older, more powerful. The shadows in the room began to twist. A shape formed before her, humanoid, yet impossibly tall and gaunt. The creature, but it wasn't the same as before. This was something far worse. The creature stepped forward, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light, its twisted form shifting as though it were made of shadows themselves. Clara could feel the weight of it pressing down on her, suffocating her very being. It wasn't just a manifestation of her fear. It was something else, something that had been waiting for her to return. "I was always here, Clara," the creature said, its voice slithering into her mind. "You can never be free. Fear doesn't fade. It grows until it consumes you. And now it's my turn." Clara felt a cold rush of terror wash over her, but she didn't back down. She clenched her fists, the book in her hand, as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. "I'm not running anymore." She had no choice but to face it. But this time, she would confront more than her fear. She would face the very thing that had haunted her for so long. The creature loomed before Clara, its glowing eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel like it could see straight through her. It was a terrifying sight, an amalgamation of shadows and twisted limbs, its form shifting in ways that defied logic, as if it existed in more than one dimension at once. The air felt thick, oppressive, like a fog that hung heavy over everything. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, flooding her mind with countless voices, each one begging for her attention, pulling at her thoughts. "You cannot defeat me, Clara," the creature rasped, its voice a twisted blend of both cold and warmth. "I am your past. I am your fear. I am your darkest regret, the things you never let go of." Clara's grip on the book tightened. "It's true, I've never let it go," she realized. She had spent years trying to bury the pain, the fear, the trauma that had shaped her life. But the nightmares, the creature, it was all a reflection of the broken parts of herself that she had never healed. The memories she had tried to forget. "But I can face them now. I've already come so far." She raised her chin, her fear now tempered with something else, determination. The creature's form flickered, distorting as it seemed to sense the change in her energy. "You think you've won, Clara? Do you think facing your past will set you free? It won't. It never does. Fear will always find you. It is part of you, as much as you are part of it." Clara took a deep breath, steadying herself. She could feel the energy of the room, the book pulsing in her hands, the air humming with an ancient power. This was the moment. There was no turning back. The creature's grin stretched impossibly wide, its teeth sharp and jagged, and for a moment, Clara almost faltered. But then she remembered the words she had read in the book. "Only by facing what you have buried can you banish it." "You are nothing," Clara said, her voice stronger than she felt. "You're just a shadow, a reflection of the past I've already left behind." The creature howled, a terrible sound that shook the very walls of the study. Its form trembled, distorting as if it were fighting to hold itself together. Clara's heart raced as the creature lunged toward her, its claws reaching for her, but she stood her ground. With one fluid motion, she opened the book and began to read aloud. "Fear is born of the unknown, of the things we hide from. But only in the light can we banish it. Only when we open ourselves to the truth can we be free." The creature recoiled, screeching in pain as the words echoed through the room. Clara's voice grew louder, more powerful, as if the very act of speaking the truth could unravel the creature's form. The shadows that made up its body began to disintegrate, disintegrating with every word she spoke, like dust in the wind. "I know you," Clara said, her voice trembling but unwavering. "I know the pain, the fear, the loneliness, but I won't let you control me anymore." The creature screamed in agony, its form shrinking, losing substance, as the book's power began to fill the room. The light from the book grew brighter, stronger, until it consumed everything, and for a brief moment, Clara was blinded by the brilliance of it. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the room went silent. Clara stood there, panting, her body trembling with exhaustion. She lowered the book, staring at the empty space where the creature had been. The darkness had receded. The whispers were gone. The study was still. For the first time in years, Clara could hear her own breath. The oppressive weight that had hung over her for so long was gone. She was free, but there was a nagging feeling, a quiet voice in the back of her mind that said it wasn't over. She had faced the creature, the manifestation of her deepest fears, but was that truly the end? She glanced at the book in her hands. Its cover was worn, the pages yellowed with age, but the power within it was undeniable. The whispers were gone, but the book still pulsed with a strange energy, as if it were waiting for her next move. Clara wasn't sure what to do. The part of her that had fought so hard to confront her fears wanted to close the book, to forget it forever. But there was something else in her heart, a curiosity. She had faced the creature, but what if the book held more answers? What if there were more truths she needed to uncover? With a deep breath, Clara made her decision. She closed the book. Clara left the study and walked through the house, each step echoing in the empty silence. The house felt different now. The air was lighter, the shadows less oppressive. It no longer felt like a prison, but a place that had held memories, both painful and powerful. And now, it was a place that could be left behind. She made her way to the front door, hesitating for a moment before stepping outside. The cold night air hit her, but it was refreshing, like a cleansing breath. The world outside was quiet, peaceful, and for the first time, Clara didn't feel like she was running from something. She had faced her fears. She had confronted the darkness, and she had won. But as she walked toward her car, something caught her eye. A figure in the distance, standing just outside the boundary of the yard. Clara stopped in her tracks. A woman. She was dressed in a long, dark coat, her face hidden beneath the hood. Clara's heart skipped a beat. There was something unervingly familiar about the figure, but Clara couldn't place it. The woman's head slowly turned, and Clara felt a chill run down her spine. The figure's eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and Clara could swear she saw a flash of recognition in them, like the woman had been waiting for her. Before Clara could take another step, the figure turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows. Clara stood frozen for a moment, her breath catching in her throat. Was that? No, it couldn't have been. It was just her mind, playing tricks, the last remnants of the creature's influence trying to trick her. But something deep in her gut told her it wasn't over, not by a long shot. With a shaking hand, Clara reached for the keys in her pocket and started toward her car, the eerie feeling lingering in the pit of her stomach. She had faced the creature, but there was still something out there, something that hadn't shown itself yet. And she had a feeling that the nightmares were far from finished. The road ahead wasn't clear. It never had been, but Clara knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to run from it anymore. Whatever was waiting for her, whatever was calling her back, she would face it. And this time, she would be ready. Clara drove away from the house in a daze. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white, the night air seeming to close in around her as she drove down the winding road. Every passing tree, every darkened turn felt like it was watching her, waiting for the moment she would lose control. The town of Dark Hollow seemed to stretch on forever, a labyrinth of roads and shadows, and she had the distinct feeling that she was not alone. The figure she had seen standing outside her childhood home, who had vanished into the dark without a trace, kept replaying in her mind. Her heart pounded in her chest as she recalled the glimmer in the woman's eyes, the cold, unspoken connection between them. Who was she? It had to be a trick of the mind. Perhaps the lingering effects of the creature's presence were still clouding her perception, distorting the world around her. But Clara had never been one to ignore her instincts, and every instinct in her body screamed that something was amiss. She could no longer deny that the nightmares, the darkness, had never truly left her. They had just been biding their time, waiting for her to slip, waiting for her to make a mistake. The road ahead was dark, barely illuminated by the headlights of her car. The occasional streetlight flickered weakly, casting long shadows across the asphalt. Clara's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden noise from the back seat. She whipped her head around, her breath catching in her throat, but there was nothing there, just the empty seat. A chill ran down her spine. She forced herself to look forward, focusing on the road. Get a grip, Clara, she told herself. It's just your mind playing tricks. You've overcome this. You've faced your fear. But even as she told herself that, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something was following her. She turned the corner into a secluded area on the outskirts of town. The road was narrower here, surrounded by dense trees on both sides. The weight of the shadows felt heavier here, darker, more oppressive. It was then that she saw it. In the rearview mirror, a dark figure stood at the edge of the trees, barely visible against the backdrop of the forest. It was tall, impossibly tall, its silhouette stretched unnaturally long as it seemed to glide toward her. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching in protest, and her heart skipped a beat as she threw the car into reverse. The figure was still there, getting closer, its shape more defined now, a twisted, elongated figure with limbs that seemed to bend at impossible angles, like the creature from her nightmares. Clara's hands were shaking as she reached for the gear shift, her foot pressing harder on the gas pedal as she reversed faster, heart racing. But the figure wasn't getting any further away. It was closing in, its presence now more tangible, more real than ever before. No, not again. I can't go through this again. With a sudden surge of adrenaline, Clara slammed the car into drive and floored the accelerator. The tires screeched again as the car lurched forward, the headlights illuminating the road ahead. She glanced in the rearview mirror, and the figure was gone, vanished into the trees, as if it had never been there at all. Her pulse raced as she sped down the road, her mind reeling. Was that real? Was it still following me? She kept her eyes straight ahead, unwilling to look back, unable to bring herself to check the rearview mirror again. The air in the car felt thick with tension, as if the walls themselves were closing in on her. Eventually, she made it to the edge of town, the familiar sights of the old diner and the gas station calming her nerves ever so slightly. But as she passed, she noticed something that sent another shiver down her spine, a figure standing on the sidewalk waiting. She couldn't make out any details at first, but then the figure turned and Clara's blood ran cold. It was her, the woman. Clara slammed on the brakes, her heart hammering in her chest as she skidded to a stop, her car lurching to a halt just inches from the figure. The woman stood still in the street, watching Clara with an eerie calmness. The hood of her coat still obscured most of her features, but the faint glow in her eyes was unmistakable. Clara couldn't breathe. The figure tilted its head, as if waiting for Clara to make the next move. Clara opened the door of the car, her legs shaking as she stepped out, the cold air hitting her like a slap to the face. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice hoarse, trembling. The woman said nothing at first, but then she raised her hand in a slow, deliberate gesture. Her fingers curled into a fist, and Clara felt a sharp pain in her chest, a pressure that made it hard to breathe, as if something was pulling her inward. The ground beneath her feet seemed to tremble, the world shifting around her. "I've been waiting for you." The woman's voice was soft, almost soothing, but it carried an underlying sense of danger, of something far older and darker than Clara could comprehend. "You thought you had won, but you don't escape me that easily." Clara staggered backward, the pressure growing heavier. She felt the ground beneath her feet begin to crack, the world bending in impossible ways, as though reality itself was being warped. "You don't understand," the woman continued. "You cannot defeat me. I am part of you. I have always been part of you." Clara's knees buckled, and she fell to the ground, gasping for air as the pressure on her chest intensified. The woman moved closer, her footsteps light but deliberate, until she was standing directly in front of Clara, towering over her. "You are mine," the woman whispered, her voice barely audible over the roar of the world falling apart around them. "And you will always be mine." Clara's vision blurred, her consciousness slipping away. The last thing she saw before darkness claimed her was the woman's glowing eyes, staring down at her with something that might have been pity or something far worse. When Clara awoke, she was no longer in the car, but in an unfamiliar room. The walls were bare, the floor cold beneath her. Her head throbbed, and she felt like she had been hit by a freight train. Her body was heavy, like something was holding her down, and her mind was a fog of confusion. She tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness overwhelmed her, and she fell back against the pillow. The world around her seemed to spin in slow circles, and the only thing she could focus on was the woman's voice, echoing in her mind. "You are mine, and you will always be mine." Clara squeezed her eyes shut, willing the voice to stop, willing herself to understand what had just happened. Where was she? Why was she here? The door creaked open, and Clara's eyes snapped open. The woman stood in the doorway, her hooded figure casting a long shadow over the room. Her eyes glowed faintly, and her lips curled into a cold, knowing smile. "I see you're awake," the woman said softly, her voice a strange mixture of compassion and malice. "Good. We have much to talk about." Clara tried to move, but her body felt like it was made of lead. She struggled, her arms shaking, but the woman simply watched her, unblinking, unmoving. "You've been through so much," the woman continued. "So much fear, so much pain. But none of it is enough, is it? No matter what you do, it always finds you. You cannot escape me." "Who are you?" Clara gasped, her voice raw. "Why are you doing this?" The woman tilted her head, as if considering the question. She took a slow step toward Clara, her movements graceful and fluid, like a predator stalking its prey. "I am everything you feared. I am everything you've suppressed. The darkness that you tried to bury. The part of you that you can't escape." Clara's heart pounded in her chest as the woman's words sank in. No, she wouldn't let this happen. She couldn't let this be her fate. But the woman smiled, her expression almost tender. "You are already mine." Clara's mind was a blur, her thoughts swirling together like a storm that she couldn't navigate. The woman's words echoed in her ears, pressing down on her with the weight of something ancient, something insurmountable. She struggled against the heavy fog that clouded her mind, trying to piece together what had happened. What was happening? Why couldn't she move? Why couldn't she breathe? Her hands were cold and clammy, but her fingers dug into the thin sheets beneath her, trying to ground herself. The woman stood over her, still watching, the eerie calmness of her presence filling the room like a suffocating cloud. "You can fight it all you want, Clara," the woman said, her voice soothing, but chilling. "But you can never escape yourself. That's the truth of it. You will never escape me." Clara squeezed her eyes shut, pushing her fears down. "No," she whispered, her voice weak but defiant. "I'm not like you. I won't become like you." The woman laughed softly, a sound that sent a chill through Clara's entire body. It wasn't mocking, but it was deep, full of knowledge and despair. "You already are like me," she said, her voice heavy with inevitability. "You just haven't realized it yet." Clara's heart began to race, the room seeming to tilt and spin around her. She tried to sit up again, but the pressure that had once been on her chest returned, pushing her back against the bed. Her breath came in short, panicked gasps as she fought for control, fighting against the suffocating force. "You know this already, don't you?" The woman's voice was softer now, almost tender. "You've been running from me your whole life, hiding in your nightmares, avoiding your truths. But you can't outrun what's inside you. You've always known I was here. Always." Clara closed her eyes, forcing the thoughts away, but they lingered, persistent and unrelenting. The nightmares, the creature, the feeling of being trapped, always trapped in her own mind. The woman stepped closer, and Clara could feel the pressure building, suffocating her from all sides. The weight of everything she had been running from, her past, her trauma, her fear, pressed down on her like 1,000 invisible hands. It was as if the very room itself was closing in on her, forcing her to confront everything she had spent her life avoiding. "I am not your enemy, Clara," the woman whispered, now standing at the edge of the bed. "I am part of you. I have always been part of you. I am your fear, your rage, your despair. You cannot escape me. You cannot escape yourself." Clara's chest tightened. She wanted to scream, to fight, to push this woman, this thing, out of her life for good. But she knew, deep down, that there was a part of her that was just as twisted, just as dark as this woman. That part of her that had been buried deep in the recesses of her mind, locked away, ignored for years. The woman watched her closely, her eyes glowing brighter with each passing second. "I've seen the way you fight your own darkness," she continued, her voice calm and knowing. "You have been in denial your whole life. But deep inside, you know what I am." Clara shook her head violently, trying to shake off the sense of inevitability that crept into her bones. "No," she gasped, the word barely escaping her throat. "I won't let you win." The woman's lips curled into a smile that was both kind and cruel. "It's not about winning, Clara. It's about understanding, embracing it." Clara's pulse thundered in her ears as she fought to stay conscious, as she fought to reject the pull of the woman's words. "I am not you," she said, her voice weak but determined. "I will never be like you." The woman bent down to Clara's level, her face close enough now that Clara could see the faint cracks in her skin, as if her face were made of glass. There was something unnatural about her, something that suggested she was not entirely real. Yet she felt so incredibly present. "But you are," the woman whispered. "You just don't know it yet." Suddenly, Clara felt the bed beneath her shift, like the room was pulling apart at the seams. The darkness she had been running from for so long rushed forward, wrapping around her like chains, dragging her deeper into the abyss. She gasped for air, her chest constricting with the weight of the darkness. Her vision blurred, the edges of the room fading in and out as the shadows pressed in from every direction. But then a thought struck her. The book. She had the book with her. The power of the book had been her weapon before, the one thing that had allowed her to push back the creature and face the darkness. It had given her a sense of control, of strength, and in this moment, Clara knew she needed it more than ever. With all the strength she had left, she reached down into the depths of her mind, seeking the words from the book, remembering the ancient incantations. She had learned its secrets. She had read its truths. She could use it again. Clara closed her eyes, focusing on the words, willing them to come to the surface. She could feel the power of the book surging through her veins, filling her with a sense of purpose and strength. The shadows that had been creeping in began to recede, slowly at first, and then faster, as if they were being pulled away by an invisible force. The woman's smile faltered, her eyes widening with realization. "No," she hissed, taking a step back as the darkness around Clara began to shift and bend to her will. Clara felt the book's power surge in her chest, a force so intense that it almost felt like her very soul was being ripped apart. But she didn't care. She had a purpose now. She stood up, slowly, feeling her strength returning. The woman backed away as Clara rose, the shadows retreating further and further with every step. Clara's voice rang out in the silence of the room as she began to recite the incantation, her voice growing stronger with each word, more confident, more determined. "By light, I banish the dark. By truth, I banish the lies. By courage, I face my fear. And by my will, I set myself free." The woman screamed, the sound of her agony echoing through the room as the shadows that had surrounded Clara crumbled to dust. Clara stepped forward, the book glowing in her hands. The light it emitted overwhelming, purifying, burning away everything the woman had tried to hold on to. No! The woman shrieked one last time before she vanished into the air, consumed by the light that Clara had summoned. Her form dissolved into nothingness, leaving behind only the fading echoes of her voice. Clara collapsed to her knees, her breath ragged as the light from the book slowly dimmed. The room was silent now, the oppressive presence of the woman gone, the darkness lifted. The shadows that had haunted her for so long were no longer a part of her life. She had won, but in the stillness that followed, Clara realized something else. The book was still glowing faintly in her hands. And the truth was clear. This was not over. She had faced her darkness. She had faced the creature, the woman, and won. But the battle was far from finished. Something deep inside her knew that this was only the beginning. There were more truths to uncover, more battles to fight. Clara stood alone in the quiet room, the glow from the book dimming in her trembling hands. The oppressive weight that had followed her, taunted her, and threatened her very existence was gone for now. The woman, her manifestation of fear and darkness, had dissolved into the ether. But Clara felt a new weight settling over her, a realization that she could not shake. This victory, while crucial, felt like an incomplete chapter in a story she had yet to fully understand. As she stood there, the silence stretching on, the sense of finality that had filled her just moments ago began to unravel. The book was no longer pulsing with the same intensity. Its light had softened, becoming more like a mere reflection of the intense energy it had once radiated. Clara's hands still gripped it tightly, but it felt heavier now, as though its true power had not yet been fully revealed. The air felt thick, like the room itself was holding its breath. She glanced around. The room was sterile, white walls with no distinguishing features except a small wooden table in the corner. It was strange, everything about it seemed so ordinary, so lifeless. Nothing about it felt like the place she had been transported to when the woman had first appeared. But she didn't have time to dwell on it. What happens now? Her thoughts were interrupted by a faint noise, the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoing in the corridor outside. Clara's heart jumped in her chest, a surge of anxiety rippling through her. Was it her? Was the woman back? The footsteps grew louder, closer. Clara stepped back, instinctively clutching the book to her chest like a shield. Her mind raced. Was she trapped again? Was it all just a trick, another illusion designed to lure her back into the nightmare? The door creaked open slowly, revealing a figure standing just beyond the threshold. Clara's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't the woman. Instead, it was a man, tall and thin, his dark eyes sharp with a knowing intensity. His clothing was unfamiliar, dark leather and a long coat that seemed to blend into the shadows around him. He moved with quiet, deliberate steps, as if he had all the time in the world. "I see you're awake," the man said, his voice smooth but cold. "You've done well to banish her, Clara." Clara tensed, stepping back instinctively. "Who are you?" The man's lips twitched into something that might have been a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "My name is Corbin. I've been watching." Clara narrowed her eyes, her grip tightening on the book. "Watching? Why? Who are you really?" Corbin's gaze lingered on the book for a moment before his eyes met hers again. "I'm not your enemy," he said, though there was an air of caution in his words. "But you were playing a dangerous game." Clara took another step back, keeping her distance. "What do you want?" He tilted his head slightly, as if assessing her, measuring her response. "I want to help you, but you have to understand something important." Clara's stomach twisted. She had just escaped from one nightmare, and now this stranger was offering help. Her instincts told her to run, to find a way out of this place, but something about the way Corbin spoke made her pause. His tone wasn't threatening, just matter-of-fact, as if he already knew her answer, already knew the fear that clenched at her chest. "Help me with what?" Clara's voice was low, wary. Corbin took a few more steps into the room, the shadows clinging to him like a second skin. "There are forces in this world that go beyond what you can imagine," he said quietly. "The woman you just banished was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. The darkness you faced, the nightmares, they are not just figments of your imagination. They are part of something far older and far more dangerous than anything you have ever seen." Clara felt her blood run cold. "What do you mean?" "The nightmares are real," Corbin continued, his voice steady, almost like he was teaching her something. "The fear you felt, the darkness, it's not random. It's all connected. It's a network of power, a system of entities that feed off of the energy of fear and despair. And you, Clara, you are part of that system now." Clara shook her head, trying to push back against the sinking feeling in her gut. "No, I've been running from this my entire life. I fought it. I won." Corbin's eyes softened, but there was a strange sadness in them. "You didn't just fight it. You became a part of it. You always have been. And now you have a choice to make." Clara felt a shiver crawl up her spine. "What do you mean? What choice?" The man stepped closer, the air thickening with his presence. "You have the book, don't you? The book that binds the darkness to you, that allows you to control it, to manipulate it. But with that power comes a price. You cannot erase the darkness. It is a part of the world you live in. It is a part of you." Clara's breath quickened, panic creeping in. "No, that's not what I've been trying to do. I've been trying to stop it, to free myself." "You cannot stop what is already within you," Corbin said, his voice almost a whisper now. "What you're running from will always be there. But the question is, how will you use it? Will you continue to fight it and let it destroy you in the process? Or will you learn to control it, use it as a weapon, a tool to shape the world around you?" Clara felt the weight of his words pressing down on her. The room felt colder, darker, as though the very walls were closing in again. She glanced down at the book in her hands, its faint glow casting an eerie light across the room. For the first time, Clara understood the true scope of what she had done. She had banished the woman, the manifestation of her fear, but that fear, that darkness, hadn't disappeared. It had just been hidden away, buried deeper inside of her. And with the book, she now held the power to control it, or to succumb to it. "What will you do, Clara?" The thought came unbidden, like a whisper in her mind, as though the very book itself were speaking to her. Corbin's voice broke through her reverie. "It's not a simple choice. You will need guidance. The book will not teach you everything you need to know on its own, and you won't be able to face the other forces that await you without more help. But it's up to you, Clara. You're no longer the person you once were. Your destiny has changed." Clara swallowed hard, her mind racing. She had already lost so much, and yet, here she was, standing on the precipice of something much greater, something far more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. She didn't know whether to run from Corbin and the book, or to embrace the darkness that had always been part of her. She closed her eyes, feeling the weight of her choices pressing on her shoulders. "You have a choice," the voice echoed again, clearer this time. The book was alive. It was speaking to her. Clara opened her eyes, meeting Corbin's gaze. "Show me what I need to do," she said, her voice steady despite the uncertainty in her heart. Corbin nodded, his expression unreadable. "Very well, let us begin." The room felt colder now, the silence pressing in like a thick fog. Clara held the book close to her chest, its faint glow casting eerie shadows across the walls. She felt its power pulsing against her skin, a silent, waiting force, one she wasn't sure she could control, let alone understand. But it was all she had, all that stood between her and whatever darkness was still lurking in the world and inside her. Corbin stood just a few feet away, his eyes fixed on her, observing, waiting. He didn't speak for a long while, and Clara could feel the weight of his gaze, like he was waiting for her to come to some revelation, some decision. His silence pressed her to act, but the more she thought, the more unsure she became. Her mind felt like a maze, twisting with doubts, fears, and unanswered questions. You said there are other forces. Other things, Clara said, breaking the heavy quiet. Her voice was shaky, but there was an edge of determination beneath it. What do you mean? What am I really dealing with here? Corbin's lips tightened, and he shifted slightly, as if preparing to speak. When he did, his voice was measured, but Clara could sense a note of urgency in his words. The nightmares you faced, the woman you banished, are only one part of the puzzle. The creatures, the shadow figures that have stalked you, they're all part of something much bigger. A system, a network of entities that thrive on fear, that feed off the energy of despair and suffering. They're not just figments of your mind, Clara. They are real, and you have now stepped into their world. Clara's stomach churned. The book, still glowing faintly in her hands, felt heavier than ever, as if the weight of Corbin's words were being transferred through it. She had faced one nightmare, had fought and banished it, but what Corbin was describing felt beyond anything she had ever imagined. A network of darkness? Was it possible? She swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay focused. So, the woman, she was just one of these entities? One of many. Corbin nodded slowly. Exactly. She was a manifestation of fear, an embodiment of something older than you can fathom. But there are others, much more powerful. They operate in the shadows, pulling the strings, feeding on the fear and pain of the world. They're not just random. They are orchestrated. And now, you're caught in the middle of it. Clara's mind spun. The weight of his words, of the revelation he was offering, was suffocating. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the entire world, the people in it, the nightmares that haunted them, and the horrors lurking just beyond the veil of reality. What do you want from me? She asked, the question escaping her before she could stop it. Why are you here? Why are you helping me? Corbin's eyes flickered for a moment, as if considering his answer carefully. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. I'm not here to help you out of kindness. I'm here because you're a part of this now, Clara. Whether you like it or not. You have the book, which means you have the power to control the shadows, or at least understand them. You're connected to them, whether you want to be or not. And you're not alone in this. Clara frowned, the weight of the statement sinking in. Connected to them? She didn't want to be. She never had. She had spent her whole life fighting the darkness, running from it, terrified of what it would do to her. But now, here she was, standing in the middle of something far beyond her comprehension, holding the book that had already shown its power. You said there are others. Are you talking about other people like me? Clara asked. Others who? Can control these things? Corbin's expression darkened, and his eyes narrowed. Yes, but they are not like you. Not in the same way. Some seek to control the darkness for their own gain. Others are simply bound by it. Much like you are. You're different, Clara. I can feel it. Clara swallowed. Different? She wasn't sure whether that was a blessing or a curse. The idea of being different in this context made her feel more isolated than ever. What do you want me to do? Clara asked, her voice steady now, despite the swirling storm in her chest. Corbin's gaze softened, almost imperceptibly, as he stepped closer to her. I want you to learn, to embrace what's inside you, what the book offers. You have the power to change things, to reshape the world in ways you can't yet understand. The darkness is not just something to fight against, Clara. It's something you can wield, and I can help you. Clara recoiled, instinctively stepping back. Wield it? The very idea felt wrong, twisted. She had spent so long running from the darkness that the thought of using it sent a chill down her spine. You expect me to become one of you, she whispered, her voice trembling with fear. To become like you. Corbin's face hardened. I never said that. What I'm offering you is a choice. A chance to understand the power you hold. If you fight it, you will lose yourself. If you embrace it, you will gain control. Clara's mind was a whirlpool of emotions. Gain control? Lose yourself? She felt the book growing heavier, the weight of its power almost suffocating. The shadows seemed to move in the corners of her vision, like they were waiting for her to make a choice. She looked up at Corbin, meeting his gaze with more clarity than she had felt since the woman had first appeared. What happens if I refuse? What happens if I walk away from all of this? Corbin's lips tightened, and he took a step closer to her. You won't be able to walk away, Clara. The darkness is already a part of you. You can't outrun what's inside you. You can only choose how you face it. Clara hesitated. The idea of embracing the darkness, of wielding its power, it felt like the wrong choice. But the more she thought about it, the more she understood that Corbin's words weren't meant to comfort her. They were meant to prepare her for something inevitable. She had already been pulled into this world, already been touched by the very shadows she had been fighting. Finally, Clara spoke, her voice quiet but firm. If I agree, what happens next? Corbin smiled, a small, almost imperceptible smile, but there was something in his expression that told Clara this was only the beginning. Next, we begin. I will teach you the path. I will show you how to control what you once feared. Clara's heart hammered in her chest as she clutched the book to her. The shadows seemed to pulse around her, drawing her in, their presence stronger now, like a constant reminder of the choice she had made. All right, Clara said, her voice steady. Show me what I need to learn. Corbin's eyes gleamed with something dangerous, something knowing. Very well, let's begin. The air was thick with anticipation as Corbin stepped toward Clara, his eyes gleaming with a strange sort of approval. His hands moved with quiet precision, gesturing toward the book she still held tightly against her chest, as though it were a fragile relic. You've made the right choice, he said, his voice almost soothing now, yet there was a sharpness beneath the calm. But don't be deceived. What you're about to learn will change you in ways you can't yet comprehend. Clara's throat tightened. She was barely holding on to her resolve. The weight of the book, the force it emitted, seemed to fill the room, suffocating her, pulling her deeper into something, darker with every breath. She wasn't sure if she was ready for this, but she no longer felt she had a choice. She was already in the thick of it, and there was no turning back. Corbin stopped just short of her, his gaze unwavering. Focus. Close your eyes. Clara hesitated for only a moment before obeying, feeling the cool air of the room kiss her skin as she shut her eyes. The darkness was welcoming, wrapping around her like a heavy blanket. Her pulse quickened as she stood still, trying to calm herself. She had been through so much already. She had faced the manifestation of her deepest fears. She had fought, survived, and found strength she didn't know she possessed. But now, she was about to embrace something far darker. She felt the presence of Corbin beside her, and without warning, his voice broke the silence again. Now listen, he said softly, though his words were heavy with authority. The darkness you're about to tap into is not a simple tool. It's not something you can just use when you need it. It is a force, a living thing, and you will have to learn its language. Learn how to control it, how to bend it to your will, and it will test you, every step of the way. Clara swallowed hard. I don't understand, she confessed, her voice shaky. How do I control something like that? By letting go, Corbin replied, his tone both patient and cryptic. You cannot control what you fear without accepting it. You cannot master what you try to push away. Understand, Clara, the power isn't in the book. The power is in you, in your ability to confront the darkness, to shape it with your will, to embrace it. The air around her seemed to grow heavier as the words sank into her consciousness. Her mind was racing. The very idea of embracing the darkness still felt wrong, like she was betraying everything she had fought for. But as the pulse of the book resonated through her hands, she realized something that made her heart skip a beat. Corbin was right. She had always feared the darkness. She had always avoided it, thinking it was something that could be driven away. What if she was wrong? Her thoughts spiraled as a cold shiver crawled up her spine. What if I'd been running from what I should have been controlling? The book in her hands suddenly felt lighter, almost weightless. Her palms tingled, an electric current running through her fingers, as though the very energy of the book had surged into her. She gasped, feeling a sudden jolt of power racing through her veins. Corbin was watching her closely, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. That's it. Feel it. Let it flow through you. Clara's chest constricted, but she willed herself to keep her eyes shut, to focus on the sensation of power now swirling in the air around her. It wasn't just the book, it was something within herself. Something dark, deep, and ancient. The air became thick, almost suffocating, and Clara could hear whispers in the distance, soft at first, but growing louder, more insistent. Her pulse quickened. Were they voices? Or was it just the darkness itself, reaching for her, drawing her in? Her heart hammered in her chest. She didn't know what was happening, but she didn't want to stop. Not now. The very fabric of the room around her seemed to shift. The shadows stretched, curling like living things, creeping across the floor and up the walls. "Open your eyes," Corbin's voice commanded, and Clara did so, her eyes snapping open in surprise. The room had changed. The sterile white walls were now drenched in a sickly greenish glow, and the floor seemed to writhe, as if alive. The shadows were no longer distant. They were everywhere. They clung to the corners of the room, swirling and shifting, reaching toward Clara. She could feel them, could almost hear them, like whispers from the depths of some dark abyss. Corbin's voice cut through her rising panic. "Do not be afraid. This is what you can command. The shadows, the fear, the darkness, they bend to your will, but only if you allow them." Clara's breath was coming in quick gasps. She looked at Corbin, trying to ground herself, but the images around her were disorienting. She could feel the pull of the shadows, their whispers clawing at her mind, urging her to give in, to let them consume her. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. I can't. This isn't me." Corbin's expression darkened slightly, but he didn't move. "You've already embraced it, Clara. The darkness is within you. You cannot escape it, but you can learn to control it. You can shape it." Clara clenched her fists, fighting the rising panic, trying to steady herself. Her thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion, but one thing was certain. She couldn't let this power overwhelm her. Not like it had with the woman. Not like it had before. The shadows around her writhed and stretched, sensing her resistance, but Clara fought to stay focused. She reached out, not physically, but with her mind. She tried to feel the darkness, to understand it, to control it. Slowly, the shadows responded. The whispering quieted. The shadows stilled. Clara gasped, feeling an odd sense of power surging through her. She was doing it. She was holding them back. She was shaping them. The book pulsed again, its light brighter now. Clara's grip tightened, and she felt the darkness around her begin to twist, no longer threatening, but obedient. Corbin watched in silence, his expression unreadable. But there was something in his eyes, a knowing, a recognition that Clara had crossed some unseen threshold. "Well done," he said quietly. "You're beginning to understand." Clara lowered her hands, feeling the room return to its normal state. The shadows receded, fading back into the corners, and the sickly glow softened. The oppressive weight lifted, leaving Clara standing in a calm, almost eerie silence. But deep within, she knew things had changed. The darkness had not gone away. It was part of her now. It was inside her. "Now," Corbin continued, his tone shifting to something colder, more serious, "we begin the real work. You've learned to control the shadows, but there is more to it than just that. You will need to learn how to use them, how to make them serve you, how to bend them to your will." Clara swallowed, her hands still trembling slightly from the experience. She wasn't sure if she was ready for what Corbin had in mind, but she knew one thing for certain. She was far from the person she had been when she had walked into this room. And the shadows? They were no longer just something to fear. They were hers. The days that followed felt like a blur, an endless cycle of practice, instruction, and deep internal struggle. Clara's world had irrevocably shifted, and now, as she stood at the threshold of a new reality, she couldn't help but wonder if she would ever feel truly whole again. There was no longer a distinction between the real world and the shadows. They were intertwined, and with each passing moment, Clara's connection to that darkness deepened. The book, always pulsing in her hands, was her constant companion. Corbin's presence remained a silent guide, hovering nearby, always watching, always instructing her. He rarely gave her answers directly, preferring instead to force her to discover things for herself. It was both maddening and strangely liberating. She couldn't hide from herself anymore. Every lesson was a mirror held up to her fears, her insecurities, and her deepest doubts. Yet, with each test, Clara felt herself changing. The first few attempts at controlling the shadows had been chaotic, filled with confusion and uncertainty. At times, the shadows had felt like a wild, uncontrollable beast, and Clara had feared that it would consume her entirely. But slowly, the fears started to fade, replaced by something more unsettling, the growing awareness of her power. Today, Corbin had instructed her to meet him in the same room where they had first started their lessons. It was a cold, stark place, but now it almost felt like a sanctuary. Or perhaps it was just that Clara was beginning to accept that the darkness had become her companion. That thought sent a shiver through her, but she quickly forced it aside. She stood in the center of the room, the faint glow of the book casting long shadows against the walls. Corbin was standing to her right, arms folded across his chest, his eyes fixed on her with a mix of expectation and caution. "Today, you'll face the final test," he said quietly, his tone flat. "You've learned control, but now you need to learn how to truly use it. To shape the darkness, to command it, and to make it do your bidding. Today is when you decide whether or not you are ready for what comes next." Clara swallowed hard, feeling the familiar flutter of nerves in her stomach. The test. She had been preparing for this moment without realizing it, each step bringing her closer to something she wasn't sure she was prepared for. Corbin stepped forward, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied her. "You've grown accustomed to wielding the shadows in small ways, but this is different. This will require focus, strength, and trust in your own abilities. The shadow will not bend to weakness. It will not bend to fear." Clara nodded, swallowing down the anxiety that rose in her throat. She had come this far. She couldn't back out now. "Concentrate," Corbin instructed. "And remember, you are the one in control. The darkness serves you, not the other way around." Taking a deep breath, Clara closed her eyes and focused, reaching inward. She could feel it, her connection to the shadows, the quiet hum of power that lingered just beneath her skin. The book thrummed in her hands, its energy flowing into her, lending her strength. "Focus." She whispered the word in her mind, repeating it like a mantra. The shadows at the edges of the room seemed to respond immediately. They began to stretch and twist, curling toward her like eager tendrils. Her heart raced as the room darkened, the familiar sense of the abyss creeping closer, but Clara stood firm, trying to hold her ground. She felt a flicker of doubt. Would it be enough? A sudden surge of power erupted from within her, and the shadows around her obeyed, swirling and writhing like serpents, bending to her will. Clara's breath caught in her throat as the shadows shaped themselves into a form, a massive, twisted figure, something between man and beast. It stood before her, towering and formless at first, but as she concentrated harder, it began to take shape. She could feel the energy coursing through her veins, her body alight with the raw power of the darkness she had summoned. The figure grew more distinct, a tall, shadowy figure, its features haunting and monstrous, but with an eerie grace, as though it was alive and waiting for her command. Good. Corbin's voice echoed in the distance, but Clara was too focused to react to his approval. She was consumed by the sight of the shadow she had conjured. It was alive. It was her creation. But then, without warning, the shadow surged forward. Clara's heart skipped a beat as the figure lunged at her, a primal rush of darkness pushing her backward. The air felt thick, suffocating, and Clara's instincts screamed at her to fight. The shadow wasn't just moving, it was testing her. Clara's mind raced. She couldn't lose control now. She was the one who had summoned this power. She was the one who commanded it. With a forceful shout, Clara raised her hand, focusing every bit of willpower she had into the palm of her hand. The shadow froze, its form trembling as though caught between two worlds. Clara's body shook with the effort, but she held on, concentrating, willing the shadow to bend to her will. Slowly, the figure began to shrink, its towering form curling back into the corners of the room, retreating from her command. When it finally collapsed back into the shadows, Clara let out a shaky breath, her body trembling with exhaustion. She opened her eyes to find Corbin watching her, his expression unreadable. "Impressive," he said, his tone still flat, but there was something in his gaze that made Clara feel like she had crossed a line. "I did it," Clara said, her voice rough. "I controlled it." "Yes," Corbin said, his voice steady, but there was a glint of something darker in his eyes. "You did, but now the real test begins." Clara felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. "What do you mean?" she asked, wariness creeping into her voice. "You've learned control, but now you need to learn restraint," Corbin said, stepping closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "Control is one thing. Restraint is another. If you let the darkness consume you, if you allow yourself to give in to its pull, you'll become just like them." Clara's blood ran cold at the implications. "Them?" Corbin's eyes narrowed, and his voice grew lower, more serious. "The ones who came before you. The ones who learned to control the shadows, but who allowed it to control them in the end." Clara's breath caught in her throat. She had seen the darkness, the way it had almost consumed her before. The way the woman had risen out of her own fear and anguish. The woman who had been the darkness. But she wasn't the woman, and she wasn't going to let this control her. "I won't let it," she said, more firmly than she had ever spoken before. "I won't be like them." Corbin's gaze softened, though the edge of warning in his eyes remained. "We'll see. The darkness does not give up its hold easily. And soon, Clara, you'll be tested in ways you can't even imagine." Clara clenched her fists, feeling the weight of the power inside her. She could feel it deep in her bones. This power was hers. She had learned to control it, to shape it. But Corbin was right. She had to stay vigilant. She couldn't let the darkness define her. Not yet. Not ever. The room felt suffocating, heavy with the weight of what Clara had just learned. She had learned control, but Corbin's words echoed in her mind, each syllable burning into her thoughts like a brand. Restraint. It wasn't enough to wield the darkness. She had to keep it at bay, to ensure that it never consumed her, like it had consumed so many before. Clara's fingers twitched at her sides, the faintest echo of the power pulsing beneath her skin. She felt its pull, that constant reminder of how easy it would be to give in, to let go of the effort required to hold it back. But she couldn't. Not yet. Not ever. As Corbin turned away, his figure becoming a silhouette in the growing darkness of the room, Clara realized that she could no longer take this journey alone. The shadows would always be with her, but so would the fear of what she might become. That fear was a constant companion, whispering to her with every step, urging her to stop before it was too late. "You're not ready, Clara," Corbin said, his voice breaking through her thoughts. "The darkness is patient. It waits for you to slip for a moment of weakness. You must remain vigilant. Always." Clara nodded, her eyes locked on the darkened figure before her. She had no choice but to continue, no choice but to learn everything Corbin could teach her. If there was any chance of controlling the darkness, of keeping it from taking over, it was now. But the shadows were changing. They were no longer the mere passive things she had once controlled. They were growing more aware, more alive, and Clara could feel it. Corbin's lessons continued, each one more difficult than the last. He pushed her harder, challenging her to do more, to bend the darkness to her will. Each time she succeeded, a flicker of pride surged in her chest, but it was always followed by a deeper unease. The shadows were becoming part of her, yes, but they were also beginning to influence her thoughts, her emotions. There were moments when she wondered if she was still Clara, or if she had become something else entirely. Days blurred into weeks. Clara's training became a constant, a daily ritual. But as her power grew, so did the distance between her and the world she once knew. She hadn't seen her friends, her family, in what felt like ages. She hadn't even dared to contact them, too afraid that they would sense the change in her, the darkness she was now wielding. She could barely look in the mirror without seeing the shadow of herself that had been slowly creeping forward, taking shape. One evening, as the light of dusk began to dim and the first whispers of night crept into the room, Corbin finally stopped her mid-lesson. "Tonight," he said, his voice low, "you will face your first true trial. The shadows will test you, your control, your strength, your resolve. There is no room for hesitation." Clara felt her heart rate spike. The shadows? Test her? How much more could she take? What else could there be to face? Corbin's gaze held hers, unwavering. The shadow will show you what you are truly capable of. The question is, Clara, are you prepared to confront what lies within you? Clara didn't respond. She couldn't. She wasn't sure if she was prepared to face herself. But before she could say anything, Corbin was already moving, his hand outstretched. The moment his fingers grazed the air, the room shifted again, the very atmosphere bending, warping. The shadows that had once lingered in the corners now surged forward, twisting into dark tendrils that encircled Clara, tightening with each breath. "Your test begins now," Corbin said, his voice cold and distant. The shadows writhed around her, swirling, becoming thicker and darker with every passing second. Clara could hear the faint sound of whispers, distant at first, then growing louder, like voices from the depths of some forgotten place. She closed her eyes, forcing herself to concentrate. This was what she had been training for. She had to control it. But the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They clawed at her mind, scratching, digging at her thoughts, drowning out her focus. "You're nothing but a shadow now. You'll never be more. It's too late. You've already fallen. You belong to the darkness." The words sliced through her, and for a moment, Clara faltered. The whispers were too strong. They felt so real, so tangible, like a part of her, clawing its way to the surface. She wanted to scream. She wanted to fight against it. But the voices persisted, drowning out her every thought, twisting her emotions, pulling her deeper into the abyss. "You've already lost. You're just like them." Her heart raced, panic threatening to consume her. The shadows felt like they were closing in, suffocating her, pulling at her limbs, wrapping themselves around her chest. But then, just as Clara felt she might be lost forever, she remembered Corbin's words. "Restraint, control. You are the one who commands the darkness." Her breath hitched as she forced herself to focus. She reached within herself, feeling the pulse of the power coursing through her veins. It was still there. The darkness had not left her. It had become a part of her, and it would not control her. Not now, not ever. With a roar, Clara shoved the shadows back, her hands outstretched. She felt the energy surge through her, pushing against the whispering voices, fighting the weight of the darkness. Slowly, the tendrils loosened, retreating back into the corners of the room. Clara's body trembled with the effort. but she stood her ground. The darkness had tested her, but she had fought back. When the shadows finally settled, leaving Clara standing in the middle of the room, gasping for breath, Corbin was there, watching her with quiet approval. But there was something else in his gaze, a flicker of something darker, something almost foreboding. "You passed," he said, his voice cold. "But understand this, Clara, you are not as strong as you think. The darkness will always be a part of you. You can control it. For now. But in the end, it will always be waiting for you to slip." Clara's chest tightened as his words sank in. She had won tonight, but she knew that this was only the beginning. The shadows would always be there, lurking in the corners, whispering. And sooner or later, they would try again. But Clara had learned something important tonight. The darkness could test her, it could pull at her, but she could fight back. She could control it. And as long as she kept her focus, she could remain free. But that freedom came at a price. The darkness would always be waiting. And so, too, would she be. The days passed in a blur of shadows and training. Clara's mind was a battleground, constantly torn between the urge to wield the darkness and the desperate need to resist its pull. Each lesson brought new revelations about herself, about the shadows, and about Corbin's true intentions. She was growing stronger, but with that strength came an increasing sense of unease. What Corbin had said on the night of her first test kept echoing in her mind. The darkness will always be waiting for you to slip. The thought alone sent a shiver down her spine. How much longer could she keep control? She had already seen what happened to those who gave in completely, those who let the shadows become their masters instead of their tools. Corbin had warned her about it, about the price of power. But the power was intoxicating. Each time she managed to wrestle the darkness back into submission, a small thrill would surge through her, and the idea of what she could accomplish with it would make her head spin. She could feel herself changing. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but the shadows were beginning to speak to her. Not in the same way as before, with the whispers that plagued her thoughts. No, these were different. They felt alive, as if they knew her, as if they were aware of her every move, waiting for the smallest moment of weakness. Clara had been restless for days. She hadn't slept properly since her last test. The shadows continued to stir in the corners of her mind, their presence impossible to ignore. They seemed to be pulling at her, beckoning her to venture deeper, to give in. But she refused. She couldn't afford to lose herself. Not again. The problem was, Clara no longer knew who she was without the shadows. One evening, after a particularly grueling lesson in which Corbin had pushed her beyond her limits, Clara found herself standing at the edge of the cliff, overlooking the dark expanse of the valley below. The winds howled around her, tugging at her clothes, but she barely noticed. Her mind was elsewhere, lost in the vastness of the shadows that stretched before her. She closed her eyes and reached out with her senses. She could feel the shadows around her, feel them creeping, stirring beneath her skin. They were waiting for her to give them permission to take control. What if I just let go? The thought flashed through her mind before she could stop it. It was so tempting, the relief that came with surrendering to the darkness. No more struggle, no more fight, just acceptance. But then she remembered Corbin's words, his warnings, and the faces of those who had fallen to the shadows before her. She couldn't be like them. She wouldn't be. A faint rustling broke her from her thoughts. She turned sharply, her senses heightened, the shadows reacting to her sudden movement. Corbin stood at the edge of the cliff, his eyes darkened with a kind of unreadable intensity. "You've come far," he said, his voice low and steady. "But there is still much you don't understand." Clara swallowed, unsure of how to respond. She felt a strange pull toward him, an almost magnetic attraction that made her heart race and her palms sweat. The darkness within her seemed to flare in response, as if recognizing something in him, something familiar. But she pushed the thought aside. "What do you mean?" Clara asked, her voice trembling slightly. Corbin took a step forward, his gaze never leaving hers. You think you're in control, but you're not. The darkness has already begun to shape you, whether you realize it or not. And soon, it will ask you to make a choice. Clara felt a chill spread through her pulse quickening. A choice. He nodded. Yes, the darkness does not simply consume. It offers power. It gives you what you desire, what you need. But in return, it asks for something more. Clara's throat tightened. What does it ask for? Corbin's eyes flashed with something dark, something that made her shudder. Everything. The darkness does not give without taking. It will require your soul, your humanity, your very essence. Clara took a step back, her mind spinning. I won't let it, she said, her voice sharp. I can control it. I won't let it take me. Corbin's lips curled into a thin smile, but there was no warmth in it. You say that now, but time is a way of changing things. The longer you resist, the harder it will become. You'll see. Clara shook her head, trying to push the fear that had begun to coil in her chest. I won't give in to it, she said more firmly. I'll fight it. Corbin's expression softened, just for a moment, as if he were looking at her with a strange mix of pity and something darker. You're not fighting the darkness, Clara. You're fighting yourself. The words hit her like a blow. She staggered back, her heart racing as the weight of his words sank in. She wasn't just fighting the shadows. She was fighting the part of her that wanted the power. The part of her that had been seduced by it. Suddenly, a burst of energy surged through her, and Clara gasped, her body trembling. The shadows rose from the ground like serpents, swirling around her, reacting to the conflict within her. She could feel them tugging at her mind, urging her to give in, to release herself from the struggle. She gripped the book in her hands, the pages practically vibrating with energy. Her mind flashed back to the first time she had encountered the book, the first time she had summoned the darkness. It had been so easy then, so simple. But now it was different. The shadows were no longer just a tool. They were a part of her. Corbin stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. It's not too late to accept it, to embrace it. All that you've ever wanted is within your reach. Power, control, freedom. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She could feel the pull, the temptation, rising within her. The darkness promised everything she had ever dreamed of. It promised to take away her fear, her uncertainty. It promised to give her the strength she needed to protect herself from everything and everyone. But at what cost? The shadows pulsed around her, thick and heavy, closing in on her like a flood. She could almost taste the power, feel it thrumming in the air, calling to her. Just let go, it whispered. Clara clenched her fists, shaking her head. No, she couldn't. She turned away from Corbin, her voice barely above a whisper. I won't become like them. I won't let the darkness take me. For a moment, there was silence. Then Corbin's voice, low and dangerous, drifted toward her. You'll come to understand soon enough, Clara. The darkness is never as far away as you think. Clara didn't turn back. She couldn't. The pull was growing stronger, but she refused to give in. She had to remain strong. She had to fight. She walked away, leaving Corbin and the shadows behind, but she knew in her heart that the hardest battle was yet to come. Clara's footsteps echoed as she walked away from the cliffside, away from Corbin and the darkness that seemed to follow her wherever she went. The cold wind cut through her, and for a moment, she felt the weight of the world pressing in on her chest. She had made her choice. She would fight. She would resist the darkness, no matter how strong its call. But the shadows, those damned shadows, were never far behind. Even now, as she walked, she could feel their presence, lingering like a dark cloud on the edge of her awareness. They whispered, tugging at her, reminding her of their power. Just let go. You know you want to. Power is your birthright. The words slid into her thoughts, but Clara pushed them away. She couldn't afford to listen. Not now. Not ever. But Corbin's warning lingered, gnawing at her. The darkness is never as far away as you think. He was right about one thing. It wasn't just a force she could control. It was a part of her now, a part of who she was becoming. The deeper she dove into her training, the more it took hold of her. The power was intoxicating, and with it came the promise of something greater, something she couldn't resist forever. She clenched her fists, willing herself to focus. The path ahead was unclear, but she had to stay true to herself. She couldn't afford to become another lost soul consumed by the shadows. The walk back to the house felt longer than usual, the quiet of the night pressing in on her, the stars above too distant to offer any comfort. As Clara reached the door, she stopped, the sensation of being watched prickling at the back of her neck. She spun around, expecting to see Corbin, expecting him to have followed her, to continue his relentless push for her to embrace the darkness. But there was nothing, only the stillness of the night. Clara let out a shaky breath, pushing the thought aside. She was being paranoid. Corbin was right. The darkness was always there, lurking, waiting for a moment of weakness. But she wouldn't give in. Not now. Not ever. She stepped into the house and closed the door behind her. But the moment she turned, she froze. Her eyes locked on the familiar figure standing in the hallway. Lydia. Clara's voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. Her sister, Lydia, stood in the doorway of the living room, her face a mixture of concern and confusion. She hadn't seen Lydia in what felt like an eternity. The girl looked different, older somehow, but there was something in her eyes, something that made Clara's stomach twist with dread. It was fear. Clara, Lydia's voice cracked as she stepped forward. What's happening to you? Clara swallowed, her heart racing. What do you mean? Lydia shook her head. You're different. I can feel it. You've changed. What's happening to you? Are you in danger? Clara took a step back, her mind spinning. She hadn't expected Lydia to show up, not after everything that had happened. She hadn't told anyone about her training, about the darkness inside her. But Lydia had always been sensitive, always able to sense when something was wrong. And now, Clara could see it in her eyes, the fear that she had kept hidden for so long. I'm fine, Clara said, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Everything's fine. I'm just learning some things. I've been busy. Lydia didn't seem convinced. Her eyes narrowed, and she stepped closer. Busy with what? Clara, I'm scared. You're not yourself anymore. I don't know what you're doing, but it's not healthy. Clara felt a pang of guilt, but she shoved it aside. She couldn't let Lydia see her weakness. She couldn't let anyone see what was happening inside her. I'm fine, she repeated, her voice cold this time. You don't understand. But Lydia's expression softened, and for a moment, Clara thought she might break. I do understand, Lydia said softly. I can feel it, Clara. The shadows. They're everywhere. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't said anything about the shadows. She hadn't told Lydia a thing. But Lydia knew. How? Lydia took another step forward, her eyes filled with concern. Please, Clara, you have to stop. You're not the person you used to be. I can feel it in my bones. Please tell me what's going on. Clara took a deep breath, her hands trembling at her sides. She had wanted to protect Lydia from all of this, to keep her safe from the darkness that was slowly consuming her. But Lydia had already seen it. She knew. I can't explain it, Clara said, her voice breaking. It's complicated. There's so much I don't understand. But I can't stop. Not yet. Lydia stepped forward again, her hands reaching out to Clara. You don't have to do this alone, she said gently. I'm here. We'll figure this out together. Please, Clara, don't push me away. For a moment, Clara stood frozen, the conflict inside her tearing at her. She could feel the darkness rising within her, urging her to shut Lydia out, to keep her safe from the truth. But the small part of her that still felt human, still felt like Clara, wanted to reach out to let Lydia in. But that part was fading. The shadows around Clara stirred, rising like a storm cloud, their tendrils curling into the air. Lydia's eyes widened, and for the first time, Clara saw the fear she had been hiding. The fear of her. "Clara, what's happening?" Lydia whispered, her voice trembling. The shadows swirled violently around Clara, pulsing with power. They were no longer just a part of her. They were demanding control, and Clara could feel them clawing at her, ready to consume her. "No," Clara whispered to herself, her voice barely audible. She couldn't let it happen. Not like this. Not now. But the darkness wasn't listening. It was growing stronger, swirling faster, closing in on Lydia. "Clara!" Lydia cried out, her voice breaking with panic. In that moment, Clara understood something crucial, something she had refused to accept until now. She wasn't in control. The shadows had already claimed her, and they weren't going to stop. They were waiting for her to give in, to release them. And the more she fought, the more they fed. Lydia stumbled back as the shadows reached toward her, but Clara couldn't move. She was paralyzed by the force of the power swirling inside her, tugging her in every direction. Her sister's terrified face was the last thing she saw before everything went black. When Clara awoke, the first thing she noticed was the oppressive silence. No whispers, no shadows, just a suffocating, empty stillness that seemed to stretch on forever. She could feel the weight of the darkness still lingering, but it was distant somehow, as if it were waiting for her to reach out and claim it once more. She sat up slowly, disoriented, her limbs feeling heavy. Her head ached, a dull throb that pulsed with every heartbeat. Clara's eyes darted around, taking in the familiar surroundings of the house, but everything fell off. The shadows that normally curled in the corners of her vision were gone, and the air felt too thick, too quiet. She turned her gaze to the door. Lydia was gone. Panic surged through Clara. She scrambled to her feet, her breath quickening as her mind raced. What had happened? Where was Lydia? Had the darkness taken her? Had Clara hurt her? She stumbled to the door, throwing it open with frantic urgency. The house was still, too still. There was no sign of her sister. "Lydia!" Clara's voice trembled as she called out, but there was no response. She ran down the hallway, the walls closing in around her as her thoughts spiraled. Had she lost control? Was she still safe? Clara's heart raced as she pushed open the front door and rushed outside, her eyes scanning the darkened yard. The wind had picked up, whipping around her in an eerie, disorienting gust. The shadows seemed to shift unnaturally, as though they were alive, following her every movement. "Lydia!" she screamed, her voice echoing through the still night air. But there was no answer. Clara's mind was a jumbled mess. She could still feel the remnants of the darkness, like a clawing presence inside her, trying to reach the surface. She wouldn't let it, but she had to find Lydia. With every step, the weight of her actions pressed on her. The power, the darkness, it was growing stronger, and she could feel it feeding on her fear. It was like an animal, a creature gnawing at the edges of her mind, pulling her in, forcing her to succumb. She shook her head, desperate. No! She couldn't give in. Clara ran toward the edge of the woods, her footsteps faltering on the uneven ground as her senses reached out, searching for any sign of her sister. The trees loomed over her, casting twisted, gnarled shadows that seemed to reach for her, pulling her closer to the unknown. "Lydia!" Clara cried again, her voice raw with desperation. And then, as if in answer, she heard a soft rustling from the trees. Clara's heart skipped a beat. Could it be her sister? She pushed through the brush, her breath coming in ragged gasps, until she reached the clearing where the moonlight spilled across the ground. There, standing at the edge of the clearing, was Lydia. Clara's heart soared. "Lydia!" she exclaimed, running toward her. But Lydia didn't move. Clara skidded to a stop in front of her sister, her chest heaving with exhaustion and fear. Lydia's expression was unreadable, her eyes distant and glassy, as though she were seeing something far beyond Clara. Her hands hung limply at her sides, and her lips were parted, as if she were on the verge of speaking, but no words came. Clara reached out to touch her arm, but the moment her fingers made contact, a jolt of coldness shot through her, freezing her in place. Lydia's eyes flicked to Clara, and for a brief moment, Clara saw a flicker of recognition in her gaze. But then it was gone. A tremor ran through Clara. "Lydia, what's happening? Please talk to me." Lydia blinked slowly, as if waking from a deep, trance-like sleep. But her voice, when it came, was not hers. It was lower, colder, darker. "You've been chosen," the voice said, the words strange and unsettling, as if they didn't belong to Lydia at all. Clara's blood ran cold. The shadows, had they taken Lydia too? "What do you mean?" Clara whispered, her heart pounding. "You've already taken the first step," the voice continued, its tone almost mocking. "You can feel it, can't you? The power, the darkness. It is waiting for you. It always has been." Clara's mind reeled. The shadows? Were they speaking through Lydia? Was this some trick of her own mind? No, she couldn't let them win. "You have to fight it, Lydia," Clara said, her voice shaking with urgency. "Please, you're still in there. I know you are." But Lydia's face remained empty, her eyes clouded with something far darker. A low laugh escaped her lips, echoing in the stillness of the night. It wasn't her laugh. It was the sound of something malevolent, something that had taken root deep inside her sister. "You cannot fight what is inevitable," Lydia said, her voice growing cold. "The darkness will consume all." Clara stepped back, her pulse quickening. This wasn't Lydia. She had to do something, anything, before the darkness fully claimed her. She couldn't lose her. Not like this. But then, the shadows around them seemed to surge, crawling toward Lydia like hungry serpents, wrapping themselves around her, twisting in unnatural patterns. They pulsed and flickered, as if responding to an invisible force, a force that Clara now knew all too well. "No," Clara whispered, stepping forward. The shadows recoiled as she moved, as if aware of her presence, but they didn't retreat. They only waited, as if they were daring her to make the choice. Clara's hand shook. Her sister was slipping away, and with every passing moment, the shadows grew stronger. But Clara had felt this power before, the pull of it, the temptation to let it consume her. But if she gave in now, if she allowed it to take over, there would be nothing left of Lydia, and nothing left of her. She took a deep breath, gathering every ounce of strength she had left. She couldn't let the darkness claim Lydia or herself. "Not like this. I won't let you win," Clara said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "Not this time." The shadows recoiled at her words, their tendrils twisting in anger. Clara could feel them pushing against her, testing her resolve, but she stood firm. She would not fall. Suddenly, Lydia's eyes snapped into focus. The darkness that had gripped her sister seemed to ebb, just slightly, like a passing storm. For the briefest moment, Clara saw the flicker of recognition in Lydia's gaze, the sister she had known and loved, standing before her. "Clara," Lydia whispered, her voice faint, like a distant echo. "Help me." Clara's heart twisted with relief. But she knew the battle wasn't over. The darkness would not give up so easily. "I will," Clara whispered back. "I promise." The shadows recoiled, thrashing violently as Clara stood her ground, ready to fight for Lydia, ready to fight for herself. But the war was far from over, and the darkness was just beginning to show its true face. Clara's breath came in short, ragged gasps as she stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. The shadows writhed around Lydia like serpents, flickering in and out of existence, always threatening to consume her. For a moment, the darkness seemed to hesitate, as if it too was aware of the fragile thread of hope that Clara had clung to, the thread that was Lydia's last chance for survival. Lydia's eyes, once glazed and distant, now focused on Clara, the faintest spark of recognition burning within them. "Clara," she whispered again, her voice barely audible, like a prayer on the wind. I can't fight it. I can't." Clara's throat tightened with the weight of her sister's words. She could see the struggle in Lydia's eyes, the battle between the person she had always known and the dark force that now sought to claim her. It was as if the shadows had a mind of their own, and they were forcing Lydia to give in, pulling her deeper into their grasp with every passing second. "No, Lydia," Clara said, her voice firm and resolute. "You can fight it. You can beat this. You're not alone. I'm right here." Lydia trembled, her body convulsing as if something inside her were fighting to break free. Her eyes fluttered, then went wide with fear. "I can feel it," she gasped. It's too strong, Clara. It wants me. It wants to take me." Clara stepped closer, her feet steady despite the pull of the darkness around her. She reached out, her hand trembling as she extended it toward her sister. She could feel the coldness radiating from Lydia's body, the chill of the shadows that had consumed her, but she couldn't pull away. "Not now. I won't let it take you," Clara said, her voice stronger now, tinged with desperation. "You're my sister, Lydia. I'll fight for you. I swear." For a moment, nothing happened. The darkness seemed to pause, as if listening, waiting for the inevitable. Then, with a violent hiss, the shadows surged forward, thrashing like a storm come to life. Clara cried out, instinctively shielding herself as they coiled around her like a tightening noose. The air grew thick, oppressive, and Clara could barely breathe as the cold seemed to creep into her bones. "Clara!" Lydia's voice cracked, a raw, tortured sound that filled the night air. Don't touch it. It's not just in me. It's in you too. You've already..." "No!" Clara's shout cut through the darkness. She shook her head violently, refusing to believe what her sister had said. "I'm not like you, Lydia. I won't give in. You don't understand. I'm not going to let it control me. Not again." The shadows twisted, crawling toward her, clawing at her from all directions. Clara's body tensed, every fiber of her being resisting the pull, the dark energy that threatened to overtake her. She could feel the weight of the darkness pressing down on her chest, squeezing the air from her lungs. It was so familiar, so dangerously close to the power she had once sought to wield, but Clara knew better now. She had seen what it did. She had seen what it could turn her into. She couldn't let it win. With a forceful cry, Clara reached deep within herself, digging for the strength she had once doubted. She felt the power stirring inside her, no longer an enemy, but something she could control. She was stronger than the shadows. She had to be. "I'm not going to give you control," Clara muttered under her breath, her hands trembling as they glowed faintly with a pulsing energy. "Not anymore." The shadows hesitated, recoiling as if they could sense the shift in Clara's will. She concentrated, her heart pounding, willing the darkness to release its grip on her. Slowly, bit by bit, the shadows that had encircled Lydia began to retract, swirling away from her sister's form as Clara poured all her energy into the struggle. The coldness in the air began to recede, and Lydia's expression shifted. Her eyes fluttered open, a new light burning there, one that had not been there before. Clara glanced at her, desperation still lacing her voice. "Lydia, stay with me. Please. You can do this. You can fight." For a moment, Lydia didn't respond. Her gaze locked with Clara's, and for that one brief, fleeting moment, Clara saw her sister. Not the puppet of darkness, not the hollow shell, but Lydia, the real Lydia, fighting her way back from the edge. I'm trying," Lydia gasped, her breath coming in shallow, jagged bursts. "But I don't know how much longer I can hold on." Clara's hands burned with energy, the air around her crackling as the shadows fought against her, pushing back, clawing at her. It was too much. She couldn't hold it back forever. "You don't have to fight it alone," Clara said, her voice thick with emotion. "We'll do it together." And with that, something inside her snapped into place. Clara felt a wave of clarity wash over her, a surge of power that was hers to wield. The darkness was part of her, yes, but it wasn't everything. She wasn't defined by it. She could be more than the shadows that clung to her, more than the power that tried to consume her. "Lydia," Clara said again, her voice steady and clear. "I'm not leaving you. We're in this together." The shadows, now swirling in violent spirals around them both, began to recede, their movements less aggressive as they tried to pull back from the light that Clara had summoned. The glow around her intensified, filling the clearing with a soft, steady light that pushed the darkness back inch by inch. Lydia's eyes fluttered, her face contorting with pain as the shadows fought against Clara's pull, but Clara wouldn't let up. She couldn't afford to. With a final, shuddering gasp, Lydia dropped to her knees, tears streaming down her face as the shadows recoiled completely. The air around them cleared, the oppressive weight lifting as the last of the dark tendrils vanished into the wind. Clara collapsed beside her sister, her body trembling with exhaustion. She held Lydia tightly, as if she were the only anchor left in the world. Lydia's face, once filled with torment, now looked peaceful, exhausted but free. "Clara," Lydia whispered hoarsely, her voice small but filled with gratitude. You saved me." Clara smiled weakly, brushing the hair from her sister's face. "No, Lydia, you saved yourself. You fought. We both did." Lydia shook her head slightly. "I couldn't have done it without you." Clara pressed a kiss to her sister's forehead, a quiet promise passing between them. "We're not done yet. The darkness won't give up so easily, but we'll face it together." The night around them was still and calm, but Clara knew this battle wasn't over. The shadows might have retreated for now, but they weren't gone. Not completely. But as long as they stood together, Clara believed they could fight anything. The silence around them felt almost unreal, a calm that contrasted sharply with the chaos that had just unfolded. The air was cool now, the oppressive weight of the darkness lifting, but Clara knew it was only temporary. The shadows had retreated, only for now. They were not gone, not forever. Lydia stirred in Clara's arms, her breathing still ragged but slowing. The energy from their shared struggle had drained both of them, leaving them weak, vulnerable. But Clara wouldn't let go. She couldn't afford to. "Not now. We need to get inside," Clara said softly, her voice hoarse. "We're not safe out here." Lydia nodded, her face pale but determined, and with Clara's help, she rose to her feet. The night air was cool against their skin, a stark contrast to the heat of the battle they had just fought. The house loomed ahead, a familiar refuge that now felt more like a fragile sanctuary than a place of safety. As they walked slowly back toward the house, Clara kept one arm around Lydia's shoulders, half dragging her as they made their way across the yard. She could still feel the pull of the darkness lingering in her own veins, a constant reminder of the power she had once tried to control. It was still there, just beneath the surface, waiting to resurface at the slightest crack. But Clara couldn't afford to let that happen. Not now, not when they had come so far. They reached the door, and Clara paused, her hand hovering over the handle. Something felt off. She couldn't explain it, there was just a feeling, an instinct that something was waiting for them inside. She glanced at Lydia, who seemed to sense it too. Her eyes were wide, her breath coming in quick bursts as she looked over Clara's shoulder, her gaze flicking nervously toward the darkened house. "Clara," Lydia's voice trembled. "Do you feel that?" Clara nodded, her heart skipping a beat. The house was silent, but there was a tension in the air, a suffocating stillness that made her skin crawl. She pushed the door open cautiously, the hinges creaking in protest as they stepped inside. The moment they crossed the threshold, the temperature seemed to drop. The shadows within the house felt heavier, more oppressive, as if they had been waiting for them all along. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she scanned the darkened hallway, her senses on high alert. She could feel the weight of something watching them, something lurking in the corners, waiting for them to slip up. "I don't like this," Clara whispered, her grip tightening on Lydia's arm. Lydia didn't respond at first, but Clara could feel her sister's pulse quicken, the fear rising in her chest. "It's here," Lydia said, her voice barely audible. "It's waiting." Before Clara could say another word, a cold wind swept through the house, slamming the doors shut behind them with a violent crash. The house seemed to groan in response, as if it were alive, its very structure groaning under the weight of some unseen force. And then the whispers began. Low at first, soft, almost imperceptible. But then they grew louder, until they filled the house, a cacophony of voices whispering in every direction, promising nothing but pain and suffering. The shadows moved again, this time not just in the corners, but across the walls, creeping along the floor, inching closer and closer to them. Clara felt a chill run down her spine. It wasn't the same as before. This was different. This was far worse. "We need to leave," Clara said urgently, but Lydia stood frozen, her face pale with fear. "It's too late," Lydia whispered, her voice shaking. "They're here." The shadows twisted around them, coiling like serpents, their forms shifting and merging into something more solid, more alive. Clara's breath hitched as the air grew thicker, and the whispers became louder, more insistent. "Clara." The voice was familiar, though distorted, as if it had traveled from far away. "You can't run from me. I've been waiting for you." Clara's blood ran cold as the voice echoed through her mind. It wasn't just the darkness speaking. It was something else, something more ancient, more powerful. The force that had created the shadows, the force that had always been with her, lurking beneath the surface. "No," Clara whispered, shaking her head as she took a step back. This isn't real." But the shadows only grew darker, their forms twisting into grotesque shapes. The air seemed to thicken, and the temperature dropped to a biting cold that chilled Clara to the bone. And then she saw it. Standing at the far end of the hallway was a figure, a shadow, but not quite. It was tall, its form indistinct, like a silhouette made of smoke and darkness. But the eyes burned with an unnatural red glow, and as Clara met their gaze, she felt the coldness of them seep into her soul. It was the thing that had been calling to her, the thing that had waited for this moment. "I've been waiting for you, Clara," the figure whispered, its voice deep and resonant, like thunder rumbling beneath the earth. "All this time, all this pain, all this fear, it has all led to this." Clara's heart pounded in her chest. She felt the darkness closing in, the weight of it pressing down on her, suffocating her. This was it, the moment she had feared, the moment the darkness would claim her once and for all. "No," Clara said, her voice steady, though her insides trembled. "I won't let you take me." The figure chuckled, a low, echoing sound that filled the house. "You think you have a choice, Clara? You've always been mine. From the moment you first tasted the darkness, you've been mine. You can't escape it. You can't fight it." Clara's mind raced. She could feel the shadows moving closer, but she couldn't afford to let fear take hold. She had fought too hard, too long. She wouldn't let it win now. "Lydia," Clara whispered, her voice tight with urgency. "You have to fight. We have to fight together." Lydia, still trembling, met Clara's gaze. There was fear in her eyes, but there was something else too, something stronger. A flicker of defiance. Clara could feel it, a spark of hope, no matter how faint. Lydia nodded, taking a shaky step forward. "I'm with you. I won't let it take you." The figure's eyes narrowed, its form flickering as the shadows around them writhed in anger. "You think you can defeat me?" It sneered. "I am the darkness. I am the end." Clara felt the power surge inside her. no longer a foreign force, but a part of her, something she had learned to control. She reached out to Lydia, their hands meeting in a silent pact. Together, they would stand against the shadows. Together, they would fight for their lives. The air crackled with energy as the figure lunged toward them, its form dissolving into a swirl of darkness. Clara's heart raced, but she held her ground. She had to, this was the final battle, and she wasn't going down without a fight. The darkness seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, like a living thing. The figure before them, still shrouded in shadow, advanced with an eerie grace, its red eyes glowing brighter with each step. Clara felt the air thicken, the oppressive weight of the darkness pushing down on her chest. The whispers continued, suffocating, taunting, pulling at the edges of her sanity. But she couldn't allow herself to falter. Not now, not when they were so close. Lydia's hand gripped hers, and Clara felt a wave of warmth spread through her, a silent strength that helped steady her trembling nerves. Lydia's eyes were wide with fear, but there was determination there too, a fierce resolve that mirrored Clara's own. They were not alone. They were together, and that was something the darkness could never take away. The figure stopped in front of them, its presence almost tangible, like a storm ready to break. "You think you could defeat me, Clara?" It hissed, the voice now a guttural growl, deep and resonant. "You are nothing but a vessel, a temporary host. You've always been mine. You've always been mine." Clara squared her shoulders, her heart pounding in her chest, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "No, you don't own me. Not anymore." The shadows writhed around the figure, swirling like a tempest, and Clara felt the temperature drop even further. Her breath came in visible puffs, but she refused to back down. The dark energy that had once threatened to consume her now burned within her, a fire she had learned to control, a fire she would use to protect herself and Lydia. Lydia's voice broke through the heavy silence, trembling but unwavering. "Clara, we have to stop it. We have to end this. Together." Clara nodded, turning toward her sister. She could feel the connection between them, a bond stronger than the shadows that had tried to tear them apart. Together they could face anything. Together they could fight back. With one final, determined breath, Clara focused on the power within her, letting the darkness flow through her, not to control it, but to let it guide her. She had faced the abyss before. Now, she would stand at its edge and not be consumed. The figure snarled, its voice low and guttural. "You think you have control over this power? You think you can tame it?" It stepped closer, and the temperature dropped even more, the air becoming thick with an oppressive chill. "You're nothing but a pawn in a game you can't understand." Clara's pulse raced as she extended her hand, the energy within her swirling in her chest like a storm. She didn't answer the figure. She didn't need to. The power in her veins was louder than its words, more real than its threats. She knew now that she didn't have to fight the darkness. She had to embrace it, control it, and wield it against the thing that sought to destroy her. The figure recoiled, its eyes narrowing as if it sensed her growing strength. "Fool!" it hissed, and with a swift motion, it lunged toward Clara, the shadows streaking out like tendrils, aiming for her throat, for her very soul. Clara acted on instinct, her hand outstretched. She didn't know how she did it, but the shadows obeyed her command. The dark tendrils recoiled in midair, halting as if an invisible barrier had been placed between them. Clara gritted her teeth, forcing her energy outward. The shadows shrieked in protest as they tried to push through, but Clara held firm. And then she felt it, the pulse of power, the undeniable connection between herself and the darkness. The shadows had once tried to consume her, but now she was its master. She could feel it surging beneath her skin, alive with potential, as if the darkness itself had recognized her strength. "Clara now?" Lydia cried out, her voice desperate. "Don't let it control you." Clara's eyes flicked to her sister, and for a moment, The room seemed to blur as the energy within her roared to life. The shadows screeched, but they couldn't break through. Clara's breath came in shallow gasps as the power within her pulsed, louder, stronger. "I'm not letting it control me," Clara said, her voice steady. "I'm taking control." With a cry of determination, Clara pushed forward. The shadows recoiled, swirling around her, but now she was in control. The darkness that had once tried to break her, to turn her into something else, was now her weapon. She held it in her hands, like a sword forged in fire. The figure snarled, its red eyes flashing with fury. "You think this is over? You think you've won?" It roared, the voice shaking the very foundation of the house. "You can never escape me. I am eternal." Clara's lips curled into a defiant smile. "You're wrong." With all her strength, she threw her hands forward, releasing a surge of energy that sent the shadows crashing back into the figure. The darkness shrieked as it was pushed back, unable to hold its form against the power Clara wielded. The walls of the house seemed to tremble as the darkness was forced to retreat, until there was nothing left but a faint whisper that lingered in the air. The figure let out one final, agonized scream as it dissolved into the air, leaving nothing behind but an eerie silence. Clara collapsed to her knees, exhaustion sweeping over her like a tidal wave. The house, once heavy with the presence of darkness, was now still, its oppressive energy gone. But Clara knew this victory was only a temporary reprieve. The darkness would never fully leave her. It was part of her, a part of her that she would have to live with forever. But she had learned to control it, to use it as a tool rather than a weapon against her. Lydia rushed to her side, kneeling beside her, her face pale but filled with relief. "Clara, you did it. You really did it." Clara's breath was shallow, her body drained, but she managed a weak smile. "We did it," she corrected her sister. Together, Lydia hugged Clara tightly, her voice barely a whisper. "You're not alone, Clara. I'll never leave you. Not again." Clara closed her eyes, letting the warmth of her sister's embrace wash over her. For the first time in a long time, she felt at peace. The battle was over for now. The darkness had been defeated, but Clara knew that there would always be more to fight. The shadows would return, but so would she. And this time, she would be ready. The world outside had returned to its normal rhythm, though Clara knew it would never truly feel the same again. The house was quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos that had taken place within its walls. The air still held a faint chill from the battle, as if the darkness had left its lingering mark on everything it touched. Clara sat in the living room, staring out the window, her mind swirling with thoughts of the creature they had faced. The darkness, the thing that had always been with her. Its presence was still fresh in her mind, a cold reminder of how close they had come to losing everything. Lydia was pacing behind her, her footsteps light but nervous. Clara could feel her sister's restlessness, the unease that had settled into her soul ever since the battle ended. It was as if the world had changed too much, and neither of them knew where they fit in anymore. "I keep thinking about it," Lydia said suddenly, her voice cutting through the silence. "The shadows, the way they seemed so alive. I don't think they were just trying to possess us. It felt like they were trying to draw us somewhere." Clara turned her head slightly, catching her sister's eye. She could see the same worry reflected in Lydia's gaze. "What do you mean?" Lydia stopped pacing, her shoulders tense. "I don't know. It's like they were trying to pull us into the very heart of the darkness itself. Like it wasn't enough just to consume us. It wanted us to become part of it." Clara's stomach churned. She had felt it too, the suffocating weight of the shadows, the way they seemed to pulse with something far older and far more malevolent than anything she could comprehend. But what Lydia was suggesting, it unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. "We can't let that happen," Clara said, her voice sharp, even though a cold dread began to creep into her thoughts. "We won't let that happen." But deep down, She couldn't shake the feeling that the battle wasn't truly over. That the darkness, whatever it wasn't finished. Clara's phone buzzed on the coffee table, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced at it, feeling the sudden weight of dread settle deeper in her chest as she picked it up. The message was from an unknown number. She hesitated, her fingers lingering over the screen for a moment. Then she opened it. "It's not over. You can never escape me." Clara's blood ran cold, her heart pounding. She turned the phone over in her hands, trying to steady her breath. The message was simple, but it was enough. The darkness had found a way to reach her even here, even after everything. Lydia looked over at her, noticing the expression on her face. "What is it?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. Clara's throat tightened as she handed her the phone. Lydia's eyes scanned the screen, her face growing pale as she read the words. She looked up at Clara, her expression grim. "It's back. Somehow it's back." A heavy silence fell between them, thick with the weight of unspoken fears. The shadows they had faced might have been defeated, but something about the message told Clara that the true fight had yet to come. "We have to figure out what's going on," Clara said, pushing herself to her feet. "We can't just wait for it to come to us again." Lydia nodded, her resolve returning. "What if it's not just here? What if it's everywhere?" Clara swallowed, the thought settling heavily in her chest. She couldn't ignore it anymore. The darkness wasn't just something that had happened to them. It was something that had been with her, following her, waiting for the right moment. But what did it want? What did it need? "I don't know," Clara admitted, her voice quieter now. "But we have to stop it before it spreads." The house felt quieter now, too quiet. The light from the setting sun cast long shadows across the walls, and Clara felt a strange sensation of being watched. She glanced at Lydia, who seemed to be feeling the same thing. Suddenly, the air seemed to shift, becoming thick and oppressive once again. The shadows in the corners of the room grew longer, stretching as if they were alive, reaching for something. "Clara," Lydia's voice trembled. "Do you feel that?" Before Clara could respond, the lights flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. A low hum filled the air, almost like a distant echo, as though the house itself was vibrating with an unseen energy. Clara's pulse quickened. She reached for Lydia's hand in the dark, her mind racing. "We have to get out of here," she said, her voice urgent. "Now!" But as they turned toward the door, the house seemed to shift around them. The walls groaned, the floorboards creaked beneath their feet, and the very air seemed to press down on them. The shadows seemed to be closing in, and they couldn't outrun them. They were trapped. And then, from the corner of the room, a figure appeared. It was not the same as before. This figure was more solid, its presence more real, more tangible. It stepped out of the shadows, its form illuminated by the faint glow of the moon outside the window. Clara froze, her heart hammering in her chest. The figure was tall, humanoid in shape, but its features were blurred, obscured by an unnatural darkness that seemed to distort the air around it. Its eyes, red, glowing, were fixed directly on her. "I told you," the figure said, its voice a distorted whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You can never escape me." Clara's mind raced. The battle wasn't over. It had never truly ended. The darkness was back, and this time it was ready. The figure loomed in the darkened room, its eyes glowing like molten embers. Clara's breath caught in her throat, the weight of its presence pressing against her chest. The shadows seemed to curl around the figure, drawn to it as if it were a magnet. She could feel it, the same oppressive force that had nearly torn her apart before. But this time it felt different, more deliberate. Lydia's grip on Clara's hand tightened, her fingers cold with fear. "What is that thing?" she whispered, her voice shaking. Clara's heart pounded as she struggled to keep her voice steady. "I don't know, but it's not the same as before. It's stronger." The figure stepped forward, its movements eerily fluid, like a predator closing in on its prey. It didn't make a sound, but Clara could feel its malice in the air, vibrating through every inch of her body. The darkness that clung to it wasn't just something she had to defeat. It was something that was feeding off her fear, growing stronger with every passing second. "You should have listened," the figure whispered, its voice slithering through the air. "I told you that you could never escape me. I am the darkness inside you, the shadow that will always be your companion." Clara's breath quickened. The last time she faced it, she had fought to push it away, to bury it deep inside. But now it was here, taking on a tangible form, a manifestation of everything she feared. It wasn't just some malevolent entity. It was her greatest nightmare, alive and breathing, hungry for her soul. "We didn't come here to beg for mercy," Clara said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. She stepped forward, her hand trembling as she summoned the dark energy that had once been a part of her, something she had learned to control. The air crackled with the tension of it, her power spiraling in her chest. The figure tilted its head, as if amused. "You think your power is enough to stop me?" It scoffed. "You think you can control me, the very thing that consumes all in its path? You are nothing without me." Clara's heart raced. She could feel the dark energy she wielded, but it wasn't the same. It felt colder, less controlled. It was fighting against her, pushing back with a strength that was unfamiliar, alien. It was as though the darkness itself had taken on a mind of its own, refusing to be manipulated. Lydia stepped forward, her face pale but resolute. "Clara, we have to work together. We can't fight this alone." Clara nodded, her breath steadying slightly. She had always been afraid of the darkness. It was a part of her, something that clung to her like a shadow, something that had always been there in the corners of her mind. But now, as she stood beside Lydia, she realized something. The darkness wasn't just a part of her, it was a part of everything. And together, they could stand against it. The figure sneered. "You think you can control me with your weak bond? You are nothing. Together, you are still nothing." Clara's eyes narrowed. She would not be cowed by its words. She had faced this before, and she would face it again, stronger this time. The connection between her and Lydia was not a weakness, it was their strength. She raised her hand, and this time, the shadows did not push back. Instead, they surged toward her, swirling like a storm, drawn to her every command. Clara's breath came in shallow bursts as the darkness coiled around her, but she held on, refusing to let it consume her. She could feel the power building within her, flowing freely this time, not as an uncontrollable force, but as something she commanded. The figure recoiled slightly, its eyes widening in surprise. "No," it hissed. "You cannot do this." Clara's voice rang out, firm and unwavering. "I'm not afraid of you. You are a part of me, but you do not own me. I will not let you." The figure seemed to shudder, as if the very fabric of its being was threatened by Clara's defiance. But Clara felt the darkness respond to her call, a powerful energy that she had finally learned to control. She wasn't just fighting to survive anymore. She was fighting for control of herself, for her own freedom. With a fierce cry, Clara sent the shadows surging forward, not in a violent rush, but in a controlled wave that enveloped the figure. The darkness around it writhed and screamed, as though it was being torn apart from within. The figure howled in fury, its form flickering as if it were struggling to maintain its shape. "You cannot win," it screeched, its voice becoming a distortion of pure rage. "I am eternal. You are nothing but a fleeting spark." But Clara didn't waver. She pushed the darkness further, letting it break through the figure's defenses. With every pulse of energy, she could feel the figure's form dissolving, being consumed by the very force it had once controlled. The room began to vibrate as the power grew stronger, the walls groaning under the strain. Clara's mind felt like it was splitting open, the energy coursing through her like a flood. The figure's screams grew louder, a high-pitched wail of despair as its form dissolved into a whirl of shadow. And then, with one final, deafening shriek, the figure shattered. The darkness collapsed in on itself, disappearing in an instant, leaving nothing but silence. Clara stood frozen, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. The room was still again, the oppressive weight of the shadows lifting. But she could still feel the lingering presence of the darkness, like a faint echo at the edges of her mind. Lydia's voice broke the silence. "Is it over?" Clara glanced around, her pulse still racing. The shadows were gone, but the sense of unease remained. She wasn't sure if it was truly over. She could still feel the pull, the tug of the darkness, as if it were waiting for her to lower her guard. "I don't know," Clara said softly, her voice distant. "But we'll be ready." Lydia reached out, placing a hand on Clara's shoulder. "Together," she said firmly. Clara nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. Together. The battle for their souls was far from over. But as long as they had each other, they knew they could face whatever darkness still lingered. The house was eerily quiet, but Clara could feel the tension hanging thick in the air. Despite the victory over the dark figure, a gnawing feeling lingered in the pit of her stomach, a sense that the battle had not truly ended. There was something about the way the shadows had dissolved, how the darkness had screamed before it vanished, that unsettled her. It felt like a warning, like it had been forced to retreat rather than be destroyed. Clara couldn't shake the feeling that it would be back, and next time, it might be stronger. Lydia seemed to feel the same. She had barely spoken since the creature's destruction, her eyes darting around, as if she expected the shadows to reappear at any moment. It was only when Clara spoke that Lydia blinked and looked at her, breaking from her trance. "Clara, are you okay?" Lydia's voice was soft, unsure. She hadn't seen her sister this tense since the last time the darkness had tried to take them. Clara exhaled slowly, running a hand through her hair. "I'm fine. I don't know. It doesn't feel like it's over." Lydia tilted her head, considering this. "But we stopped it, didn't we? It's gone. There's no way it could." Clara's voice caught in her throat as the room seemed to grow colder. She looked at Lydia, her eyes dark with apprehension. "It's not over. That thing, whatever it was, it said I couldn't escape. It said I was its companion." Lydia frowned, her brow furrowing. "What do you mean? You defeated it, Clara." "We both did. It's over." But Clara couldn't bring herself to believe that. She had felt the darkness inside her, a living, breathing thing that had been growing ever since the first encounter. She had pushed it down, forced it back with every ounce of her being. But she couldn't help but wonder if, in the end, the darkness had never really been defeated. What if it had merely retreated, waiting for the right moment to strike again? "I'm not so sure," Clara said, her voice low. "I think it's just waiting. It's waiting for me to slip up, to let my guard down." Lydia stared at her, her eyes full of concern. "Then we need to find a way to stop it for good. We can't let it keep controlling you, Clara. We can't let it come back." Clara nodded, feeling a surge of determination. "We won't, but we need to figure out what it wants. What its endgame is. I don't think it's just after me. I think it's after something else. Something bigger." Lydia's face went pale. "Something bigger? What do you mean?" Clara stared at the floor, her mind racing. The pieces of the puzzle were scattered, but she could almost see them beginning to fit together. It wasn't just about her anymore. The darkness wasn't some random, malevolent force. It had a purpose, a plan, and it was using her as a pawn in a much larger game. "I think it's been watching me my whole life," Clara murmured, her voice distant. "And maybe it's been watching you too. Watching all of us. We were never just victims, we were part of something. A bigger scheme, something that's been set in motion for longer than we can understand." Lydia swallowed hard. "What are you saying, Clara? You're not making sense." Clara turned to face her sister, her eyes wide with realization. "What if the reason it's been chasing me all these years isn't just because I have this power? It's because I was meant to unleash something. Something far worse than anything we've seen so far. Lydia took a step back, her face a mask of disbelief. You think we're connected to all of this somehow? That we're the reason it exists? Clara nodded slowly. I think it's been following us, waiting for the right moment. And I think that moment might be now. This isn't just about surviving anymore. This is about preventing something much bigger, something far more dangerous from coming to life. The air in the room seemed to thicken as Lydia digested Clara's words. She stood still for a moment, her mind spinning with the possibilities. The darkness was alive, something ancient and terrifying. And now, it seemed, it had set its sights on a greater goal, a goal that Clara and Lydia might have unwittingly been a part of. Clara's gaze was unwavering as she spoke again, her voice filled with urgency. We need to find out what it wants. We need to stop it before it can complete whatever it's planning. And we need to do it now. Lydia nodded, her eyes filled with determination. Then we'll find a way. Together. They both knew it wasn't going to be easy. They weren't just fighting for their lives anymore. They were fighting for the world, for everything they knew and loved. But Clara knew one thing for sure. As long as they had each other, they stood a chance. The next morning, the first rays of sunlight barely made it through the thick clouds hanging in the sky. The atmosphere felt heavier, as if the world was holding its breath. Clara and Lydia set out in search of answers, not knowing where to begin. They had no map, no instructions, only the knowledge that they needed to stop the darkness from consuming everything. Clara led the way, her thoughts a whirlwind of fragmented images and cryptic words. The dark figure's voice still echoed in her mind, whispering promises of despair, of things to come. She could still hear the words, "You cannot escape me. You never will." But Clara wasn't afraid anymore. She was determined, and the weight of her sister's hand in hers gave her strength she didn't know she had. They found themselves at the edge of town, in front of an old, crumbling library that Clara remembered from her childhood. She had always felt an eerie presence here. Something about the building had unsettled her even as a young girl. She couldn't explain it, but deep down, she always knew there was something hidden in the library's dusty corners. "This is it," Clara said, her voice low. "I don't know why, but something about this place feels wrong." Lydia glanced up at the building, its windows dark and foreboding. "Are you sure? This place doesn't look like it's been used in years." "I'm sure," Clara replied. "There's something here, something we need to find. Whatever the darkness is after, it's here. I can feel it." With a shared look of determination, the sisters stepped inside. The library was even darker inside than Clara had anticipated. The heavy curtains over the windows let in only the faintest sliver of light, casting long shadows over rows of dusty bookshelves. The air smelled musty, as if the books had not been touched in decades. The silence was suffocating, a thick blanket that pressed against their ears, making their footsteps sound unnaturally loud. Clara led the way, her every instinct screaming that something was hidden here. Lydia followed closely behind, her face pale, but her eyes alert. She, too, felt the weight of the place, the eerie presence that hung in the air. It was as if the very walls of the library were holding secrets they were meant to uncover. The deeper they ventured into the library, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. It felt like they were descending into some forgotten part of the world, far removed from the present, where time had no meaning. As they passed row after row of ancient books, Clara's fingers brushed against the spines, but none of them seemed to hold the answers they were searching for. She stopped suddenly, her breath catching in her throat. "Clara!" Lydia's voice was barely a whisper. Clara turned to face her, her eyes wide. She pointed to a small, half-hidden door at the far end of the room. It was nothing more than a narrow, wooden entrance, tucked away behind a stack of old crates and forgotten debris. There was something about it, something that tugged at the edges of her memory. Lydia looked at the door, her brow furrowing. That wasn't here before, was it? Clara shook her head. feeling a growing sense of dread settle over her. "I don't think so." Without another word, they approached the door, and Clara reached out to turn the knob. It creaked in protest, as if the door had not been opened in years. The hinges groaned, sending a shiver down Clara's spine as the door slowly swung open. Beyond the door, there was only darkness. It was an overwhelming, impenetrable blackness that seemed to draw them in. Clara hesitated for a moment, her heart racing. She felt it, the same presence, the same malignant force that had followed her all this time. This wasn't just a room. It was something far older, far darker. "Clara, we don't have to go in there," Lydia said, her voice tight with fear. "Whatever's in there, it's not worth it." But Clara's resolve was firm. She knew they had to push forward. "We need to find out what it is. It's the only way." She stepped forward, her footfall echoing in the empty space. As she moved into the darkness, Lydia followed reluctantly, the light from the main library now a distant memory. The air was colder here, biting at their skin, and the oppressive sense of dread thickened with every step they took. Clara's hand reached out, groping in the dark for any source of light, but her fingers brushed only cold stone. The walls were rough to the touch, and the floor beneath their feet felt uneven, as though the ground itself was unstable. They continued forward, Clara feeling the pull of something beyond the darkness. She had to keep going. There was no turning back now. As they reached the end of the hallway, Clara's hand brushed against a smooth, cold surface. Her fingers traced the outline of what seemed to be a large stone door. She felt a chill crawl down her spine as she realized what it was. "This is it," Clara murmured. "This is what I was looking for." Lydia, standing behind her, couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. "Are you sure? This feels like—" "I know," Clara whispered, her voice strained. "I've been here before. In my dreams." The stone door was covered in strange symbols, runes, sigils, and markings that seemed to pulse with an eerie energy. They weren't just decorations. They were warnings, Clara realized. Warnings about what lay beyond this door. She didn't need to read them to understand their meaning. The darkness was alive, and it wanted to be freed. Taking a deep breath, Clara stepped forward and pressed her hand against the cold stone. To her surprise, the door groaned, the stones shifting beneath her touch. Slowly, the door began to move, sliding open with an unsettling ease, revealing a chamber beyond. The room was vast, its high ceiling lost in shadows. In the center of the room stood an ancient pedestal, the stone cracked and worn with age. Resting atop, it was a large, obsidian orb. It pulsed with an otherworldly energy, its surface glimmering with an eerie light that seemed to call to Clara. Lydia took a step back, her voice barely a whisper. "Clara, don't touch it. We don't know what it is." But Clara couldn't take her eyes off the orb. It was like a magnet, pulling her in, demanding her attention. She could feel it deep in her bones. This was the heart of the darkness, the source of everything. The very thing that had been haunting her all this time. Slowly, Clara reached out and touched the orb. The moment her fingers made contact, a surge of power coursed through her, electric and violent. Her body seized as though the darkness itself was pouring into her, filling every inch of her being. It was like a flood of shadows crashing through her mind, her soul. Clara gasped for breath, her vision blurring as the power overwhelmed her. She heard Lydia screaming her name, but it was distant, muffled, like she was hearing it through water. Clara's body trembled, her fingers gripping the orb as the darkness swirled around her. Images flashed through her mind, visions of destruction, of cities falling, of people screaming in agony. And through it all, the same whispering voice that had taunted her before. "You were always meant for this. You were the key." Clara screamed, but the words were stolen from her lips as the darkness surged higher. She was falling into the abyss, consumed by the very thing she had tried to destroy. And then, Just as the darkness was about to swallow her whole, a sharp, bright light cut through the shadows. It was like the sun breaking through the clouds after a storm, searing the darkness away with its purity. Clara felt herself being pulled from the depths, back to the light, back to herself. She opened her eyes to find Lydia kneeling beside her, her hands gripping Clara's shoulders, her face filled with panic. "Clara? Clara, can you hear me?" Clara blinked, her head throbbing as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. She felt drained, empty, but the darkness was gone. The orb was now nothing more than a dull, lifeless stone. I saw it," Clara whispered, her voice hoarse. "I saw what it wants. It was always after me, after my power. But it's not just me it wants, it's everything. It wants to open a doorway. A doorway, to something worse." Lydia's face went pale as she helped Clara to her feet. "We need to stop it, Clara. Whatever it is, we can't let it happen." Clara nodded, her resolve hardening. "We will, but we need to find a way to destroy this thing for good." The whispers that had filled her mind began to fade, but the fear remained. The real fight was only beginning. And this time, Clara knew it wouldn't be just her soul on the line, it would be the world's. Clara stood at the edge of the dark chamber, her legs shaky but steady, her thoughts racing with everything she had just seen. The orb, now dull and lifeless in her hands, seemed to be a mere shell of the terrifying power it had once held. Yet Clara could feel it lingering in the air, the darkness, the power that had been so close to consuming her, and it terrified her that it still might. Lydia had pulled Clara away from the pedestal, guiding her out of the chamber with urgency. Neither of them spoke as they made their way back through the narrow hallway, the once oppressive shadows now merely a faint echo of what they had been. The silence between them was heavy, filled with the weight of what they had just discovered. As they stepped back into the main library, the door behind them groaned and shut with a deafening finality. Clara paused, her breath catching in her throat, her mind still reeling from the experience. "What? What happened?" Lydia asked, her voice thick with worry. "What did you see? What was that thing?" Clara felt a cold shiver run through her skin prickling as she recalled the visions. "It wasn't just a weapon, Lydia," she said softly. "That orb, it was the key to a gateway. A portal, something ancient, something worse than anything we've seen before. The darkness isn't just a creature, it's a force, and it wants to bring something into this world, something that could destroy everything." Lydia's face paled. "A portal? A gateway? To what?" Clara shook her head. "I don't know, but I felt it. It's not just about me. It's not even just about you. It's using us. It's been using us from the beginning, pulling us toward this moment." The enormity of Clara's words settled over them like a suffocating weight. They had thought that the orb and the darkness were merely tools of evil, but now Clara was certain that this was part of something far greater. The darkness, the orb, it wasn't an isolated thread. It was a part of a much larger design, a plan that had been set in motion long before either of them had ever realized. "Clara, we need to go to the others," Lydia said, her voice firm. "We need help. We can't face this alone." Clara's gaze shifted to the door of the library, her chest tightening with dread. She knew Lydia was right. They couldn't take on something so vast by themselves. They needed to gather everyone, friends, allies, people who could help them fight whatever was coming. "Let's go," Clara said, her voice steady despite the storm of fear swirling in her chest. They left the library and stepped back into the world that seemed almost unchanged, as if nothing had happened at all. The streets were quiet, the sun barely peeking through the clouds. But Clara couldn't shake the feeling that everything was wrong, that the calm was only the eye of the storm. As they made their way through the streets, Clara couldn't help but replay the images she had seen during her vision. The chaos, the destruction, the twisted landscape that had sprawled before her eyes. It wasn't just a nightmare. It was a reality waiting to happen. The more she thought about it, the more certain she became that they were on the precipice of something far darker than she had ever imagined. Lydia glanced over at her sister, her expression a mix of worry and determination. "Clara, what if we can't stop it? What if we're not strong enough?" Clara stopped in her tracks, turning to face her sister. Her heart ached at the fear in Lydia's eyes, but there was no time for doubt. "We have to try. We don't have a choice." Lydia nodded, her hands tightening into fists at her sides. "We'll do whatever it takes. We'll fight it together." As they reached the end of the street, the sound of approaching footsteps caught their attention. Clara's heart leaped in her chest, her breath catching in her throat. She recognized the silhouette before it emerged fully from the shadows. It was Jonah. He had been one of the few people who knew about the strange occurrences in their lives. He had helped Clara and Lydia in the past, always standing by them when the darkness had made itself known. But now, as he stepped toward them, Clara could see the strain in his face. He had been through so much, but he looked more determined than ever. "Clara," Jonah said, his voice low and tense. "Lydia, I felt something. Something wrong. I don't know how, but I knew you'd be here." Clara felt a surge of relief at the sight of him. "Jonah, you have no idea how glad I am to see you. We need your help." Jonah's eyes darkened. "I know. I can feel it too. The darkness. It's not over, is it?" Clara shook her head. "No, it's worse than we thought. We need to find a way to stop it before it's too late." Jonah didn't hesitate. "Then I'm in, whatever it takes." Lydia's eyes flicked between Clara and Jonah, her voice filled with quiet determination. "We can't do this alone. We need to gather everyone we can. This is bigger than all of us." Clara nodded, her mind already moving to the next step. The feeling of urgency gripped her chest. They didn't have time to waste. "We need to go to the ruins," Clara said, her voice steady. "It's the only place I can think of where we might find more answers. If there's a way to destroy the darkness, it's there." The ruins, an ancient site just outside town, had always been a place of mystery and dread. Clara had never truly understood its significance, but deep in her gut, she knew it was where everything would come to a head. If they could find the answers they needed there, they might stand a chance of stopping the darkness from opening that portal. Jonah nodded. "I'll get the others. We need a plan and fast." Clara looked back at Lydia, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resolve. "This is it, Lydia. We have to face it now. The darkness won't wait much longer." Lydia met her sister's gaze, her expression unwavering. "Then we'll fight it. We'll stop it. Together." The group set out toward the ruins, each of them aware of the weight of the task ahead. But as they walked, Clara couldn't help but feel the oppressive presence of the darkness still lurking in the air, like a shadow just beyond their reach. They didn't know what awaited them at the ruins, but they were ready. They had to be. The clock was ticking, and the fate of the world hung in the balance. The walk to the ruins felt longer than it ever had before. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long, twisting shadows over the ground as Clara, Lydia, and Jonah made their way through the dense trees. The path was narrow, overgrown with tangled vines and brambles, as if nature itself was trying to keep them from reaching their destination. Clara's heart pounded in her chest with each step, and her thoughts were consumed by what lay ahead. The ruins had always been a place of mystery, a crumbling reminder of something ancient, something forgotten by time. It had been abandoned for centuries, and no one truly knew what. It had once been. Local legends spoke of curses, strange occurrences, and the kind of magic that could shape reality itself. Clara had heard the stories, but it wasn't until now that she understood the true significance of this place. With each step, the air grew colder. The whispers of the darkness, the feeling of something lurking just out of sight, seemed to press in from every side. Clara felt a strange tingling in her fingers, an electric buzz that seemed to come from the earth itself. It was like the ruins were alive, pulsing with energy, waiting for something or someone. We're getting close, Jonah murmured, glancing around nervously. He had been quiet since they'd started, his eyes scanning the surroundings as if expecting something to jump out at any moment. Lydia looked equally tense, her hand gripping Clara's arm. "I don't like this," she whispered. "It feels wrong." Clara nodded, her throat dry. The sense of dread was thick in the air now. She could feel the weight of the history of this place pressing on her, as if the very stones held memories of all that had happened here, of whatever dark force had once lived in the heart of the ruins, and perhaps still did. They reached the clearing where the ruins stood. What had once been a grand structure was now a jumble of crumbled stone, shattered columns, and broken walls. But even in its ruinous state, there was a strange beauty to it. Vines and moss crept over the stones, intertwining with the broken architecture, as if nature itself was trying to reclaim what had been lost. At the center of the ruins stood a massive stone arch, its edges worn, but still imposing. Clara felt her breath catch in her throat as she saw it, the same arch she had seen in her vision. This was the doorway, the threshold to something beyond, the portal the darkness wanted to open. "This is it," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. She stepped forward, her body trembling as she approached the arch. Her hands shook as she reached out to touch the cold stone. The moment her fingers brushed against it, a jolt of energy shot through her, and she staggered back, her vision blurring. "Clara!" Lydia cried out, grabbing her sister's arm to steady her. Clara shook her head, trying to clear the fog in her mind. "It's okay," she breathed. "I just felt something inside it." Jonah stepped forward, his face grim. "This is no ordinary ruin. It's a barrier. A seal, maybe." Clara nodded. "It has to be. The darkness, the portal, it's all connected to this. But how do we stop it?" The air around them seemed to thrum with an unnatural energy, and Clara could feel the pressure building. It was like the ruin itself was alive, watching them, waiting for them to make their move. "I've read about things like this," Jonas said, his voice low. "Ancient seals, barriers between worlds. They don't just open. They need a key." Clara turned to him, her heart racing. "A key? But what does that mean? What kind of key?" "I don't know," Jonah replied, his voice strained. "But I have a bad feeling that whatever we need, it's here." Clara's eyes darted around the ruins, searching for something, anything, that could help them. Her gaze fell on the broken pillars scattered around the clearing. Some of them were large, inscribed with markings she hadn't noticed before. Symbols, runes, the same kind of design she had seen in her visions. The same ones that had been carved into the orb. "Wait," Clara said, her voice steady now. "Look at the pillars. Those runes, they're identical to the ones in the library. They're part of the same system." Lydia stepped closer, inspecting the symbols. "You think they're connected?" "I know they are," Clara said. "We need to figure out how." Jonah crouched beside one of the larger pillars, running his fingers over the markings. "These aren't just symbols. They're part of a puzzle, a mechanism." Clara felt a shiver of realization. A mechanism, like a lock. If this place is a seal, then the runes must be part of the key to open it. Lydia stepped back, her expression serious. "And if we unlock it, what happens?" Clara's heart sank. "We don't know, but if we don't, the darkness will." The wind picked up, howling through the ruins, and the ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble. The darkness, that insidious presence, was drawing closer. Jonah glanced around. "We need to figure this out fast." Clara nodded, her mind racing. She moved toward the largest pillar, her fingers tracing the runes on its surface. They were etched deeply into the stone, as if they had been carved with great care, with great purpose. She didn't know how, but something told her that these symbols were meant for her, meant for them. "I think we have to activate them," Clara said, her voice suddenly filled with certainty. "Somehow, maybe they respond to touch." With that, she placed her palm flat against the stone. At first, nothing happened, but then The runes beneath her hand began to glow faintly. A low hum filled the air, vibrating through the ground and into Clara's bones. "What's happening?" Lydia asked, her eyes wide with fear. Clara's gaze was fixed on the glowing symbols. "It's working." A crackling energy surged through the pillar, and the ground beneath their feet began to shake violently. Clara stumbled back, her heart pounding in her chest as the runes on the pillar seemed to shift, rearranging themselves into new patterns. "This is it," Jonah said urgently. "The seal is breaking." Clara's eyes widened in horror. The very ground around them seemed to shift, and the sky above darkened as a strange, unearthly glow began to emanate from the arch. The air became thick, heavy with an oppressive energy. She could hear something beyond the arch, something deep and primal, an ancient force stirring, awakening. "Clara!" Lydia shouted, panic in her voice. "We need to finish this." Clara's breath caught in her throat as she realized they were so close, yet so far. The runes were almost fully activated, but the final piece was missing, the last symbol, the key to unlocking the seal entirely. It was clear now that they weren't just unlocking a door, they were unleashing something. And she wasn't sure they were ready to face it, but they didn't have a choice. The darkness was coming, and it wouldn't wait. The air around Clara, Lydia, and Jonah thickened as the runes continued to glow, their light pulsing like the rhythm of a heartbeat. Clara's heart raced in time with it, the sensation almost overwhelming, as if the very earth beneath them was alive. It was as if the ruins had been waiting, had been anticipating their arrival, and now the moment had come to awaken something long buried, something dark and ancient. Clara stepped back, breath shallow, trying to steady herself as the ground trembled beneath her feet. Every step she took felt like a movement toward the edge of something immense, dangerous, and impossible to comprehend. The air seemed to vibrate with power, an energy she could feel in her bones, like the earth was speaking to her, urging her to act. "Clara, we have to finish this," Lydia urged, her voice filled with worry. "It's too much. What if we're making a mistake?" Clara turned to her sister, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and resolve. "I know, but if we don't do this, whatever's waiting on the other side of that portal, it will come through, and I don't think we can stop it if it does." Jonah, standing beside them, looked up at the arch, his eyes hard with determination. "Then let's finish it." The three of them turned their focus back to the glowing pillar. The runes had shifted, and now a final symbol stood alone at the top of the pillar, glowing faintly, just out of reach. It was the missing piece, the last part of the puzzle they had to complete. Clara's heart beat faster. She could feel that this symbol was different. It wasn't just a rune. It was the key, the last step that would either close the portal or open it completely. But the uncertainty of what might happen once it was activated weighed heavily on her. What if they were too late? What if the darkness was already too far along? "Clara," Jonah asked, his voice low. "Are you okay? You look like you're thinking too much." She shook her head. "I don't know what will happen when we finish this, but I can't let whatever is waiting on the other side come through. I won't let it destroy everything." With a deep breath, Clara stepped forward again, her fingers trembling as she reached for the glowing symbol. The moment her hand touched it, the energy in the air changed, crackling violently. It was as if the entire world held its breath. Clara's fingers felt as though they were being pulled toward the stone, a magnetic force binding her to it. The sensation was maddening, powerful, and terrifying. For a brief moment, Clara was struck by the sheer enormity of what they were about to do. She could almost hear the whispers, distant voices like echoes of a time long past, calling to her, urging her to stop, to retreat. But she knew she couldn't. They had come too far. "Clara, don't!" Lydia shouted, but it was too late. With a surge of energy, the last rune flared bright, and the air around them erupted with a sound like thunder. Clara staggered backward as a shockwave of raw power reverberated through her body, sending her crashing to the ground. The world seemed to spin around her, a kaleidoscope of light and shadow, as if reality itself was warping. The ground beneath them cracked, and the sky above twisted into something unnatural, dark clouds swirling and churning in a chaotic dance. From the arch, a bright beam of light shot upward, piercing the sky, illuminating the darkness around them. It was as if the very fabric of the world had been torn open. Clara gasped for breath, trying to steady herself, but her limbs felt heavy, as if gravity itself had doubled. She looked up at the arch, and her eyes widened with dread. The portal was open. A swirling mass of shadows and light poured through, tendrils of darkness creeping out from the arch like fingers, reaching for the ground. The air became suffocating, thick with an oppressive force that made it hard to breathe. "No," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible above the howling wind. "This can't be happening." Lydia, who had also been knocked to the ground, scrambled to her feet. "Clara, what do we do now?" Clara's mind raced, her thoughts scrambled. There had to be something they could do, some way to close the portal, to stop the thing that was pushing through. But what? They had no time. The darkness was already spreading, like an infection, crawling through the ruins and into the air around them. Jonah stood beside Clara, his eyes wide with horror. "We need to destroy the portal. We have to break the connection." Clara shook her head, her heart pounding. "How? How do we stop it once it's open?" The tendrils of darkness began to writhe and snap at the air like serpents, pulling themselves from the arch and reaching toward the ground. Clara could feel the weight of their presence, the sense that something ancient and powerful was slipping into this world. The ground beneath them began to rumble, and she felt a growing sense of dread in her chest. Whatever had been unleashed was not a mere shadow or creature. It was something far worse, something that existed outside of time and space. And it wasn't alone. From the depths of the portal, a shape began to emerge. At first, it was vague, a dark silhouette, formless, its outline constantly shifting. But as it drew closer, Clara saw it more clearly. It was enormous, towering beyond reason. Its shape seemed to blur, constantly shifting between forms, but there was something undeniably wrong about it. Its very presence seemed to warp the air, distort reality, as though it were something that should never exist. "Clara!" Lydia screamed, clutching her arm in desperation. "We need to stop it now." Clara's mind raced, her thoughts a whirlpool of panic and confusion. She needed to think. The orb, the runes, everything was part of the same force. This creature, this entity, it had been tied to the orb, to the darkness, to the very fabric of this world. She had to stop it. The ground cracked beneath her feet as the entity's presence solidified, its shape towering above them, casting an unnatural shadow over the ruins. It opened its enormous, void-like eyes, and Clara felt a wave of pure terror wash over her. It wasn't just the physical form, it was the essence of what it represented, an ancient, unknowable horror that could not be contained. "We're running out of time," Jonah said, his voice strained with urgency. Clara's breath caught in her throat. There has to be a way. Suddenly, an idea struck her like a bolt of lightning. "The orb," she whispered, almost to herself. "The orb. It's a key. It has to be the key to shutting this down." Lydia's eyes widened. "The orb? We can't use it. It's too dangerous." "We don't have a choice," Clara said, her voice trembling but resolute. "If we don't try, we'll all be swallowed by this thing." The creature seemed to sense their determination, and its shadowy tendrils reached out further, snaking toward them like grasping hands. Clara turned to Jonah, eyes pleading. "Jonah, you need to go back. Get the orb. We have to use it." Jonah's face hardened with resolve. "I'll get it. You two hold on." He turned and dashed back toward the path, disappearing into the trees. Clara and Lydia turned back to the portal, their eyes fixed on the entity that was steadily growing more solid, more real, as it came through the rift. Clara couldn't allow herself to think of what might happen. She had to act. They all had to. Because if they didn't, the world would fall into darkness. The air around Clara and Lydia grew denser with every passing second, the oppressive weight of the portal's presence pressing down on them, suffocating them. The dark figure that had emerged from the rift loomed larger and more tangible by the moment, its twisted form writhing and reshaping, as if it could never truly be contained in any shape. Every flicker of its vast, shadowy body sent ripples of dread through the very ground beneath them. Clara felt as though she were standing on the edge of a great abyss, teetering between this world and something far worse, something that waited patiently in the dark corners of existence. It was a force, ancient and unfathomable, that had been freed by their own hands. She could hear the echo of Jonah's footsteps retreating, his mission to retrieve the orb, the key to stopping this nightmare. Every moment stretched like an eternity, and Clara felt the cold grip of fear clawing at her heart. Lydia stood beside her, trembling, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "Clara, we have to trust Jonah. He'll get the orb, and we can close this, stop it. We have to believe that." Clara nodded, trying to focus on her sister's words, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the darkness, the way it seemed to curl and pulse with hunger. "What if it's too late?" she whispered. "It's not too late," Lydia said firmly, her eyes shining with fierce determination. "We can still fix this." The creature's tendrils reached toward them, its form now growing clearer, as if it were trying to step into their world to fully emerge. It was like a living shadow, a mass of writhing limbs and faces that flickered in and out of existence, each one more grotesque than the last. The air hummed with an energy so thick that Clara could feel it deep in her chest. For the briefest moment, Clara's thoughts flickered to everything they had gone through: the visions, the orb, the ruined library, and the symbols that had led them here. This had always been the final step, the moment when the portal would open, when the darkness would either be contained or unleashed. But she couldn't let this thing win. Jonah had to make it back with the orb. They had to stop the entity from fully entering their world. It wasn't just their lives at stake, it was everyone's. The creature's glowing eyes turned to them, narrowing in a way that sent an icy chill down Clara's spine. It knew they were there, knew they were the ones standing between it and freedom. The air crackled with its power, and Clara could feel her limbs growing heavy, as if the darkness was drawing strength from the very atmosphere. Then, she heard it, a distant crash from the trees, followed by Jonah's voice. "Clara! Lydia!" Clara turned toward the sound, her breath catching in her throat. Jonah was running back toward them, clutching the glowing orb tightly in his hands. The orb pulsed with light, the same eerie glow they had seen before. It was their only hope. "Jonah, hurry!" Lydia shouted. The moment Jonah stepped into the clearing, the creature's form surged forward, its tendrils like writhing serpents, snapping at the air with terrible speed. Clara's heart pounded in her chest as the shadow reached toward Jonah, but he didn't hesitate. He raised the orb high above his head. The moment the orb caught the light of the portal, the dark figure let out a deafening scream, its body writhing violently as if it were being pulled back into the rift. The air around them grew cold, the shadows began to retreat, and the energy that had once been suffocating now felt brittle, weak, as though it were dissipating. "Clara, the symbol!" Jonah shouted. "The final rune! We need to use it to close the rift." Clara's heart raced as she turned toward the glowing pillar. The final rune was still pulsating, waiting for the orb to complete the connection. Without thinking, Clara sprinted toward it, reaching out for the glowing stone. The moment her hand touched it, everything went still. The orb in Jonah's hand flared brighter than it ever had, and the runes along the pillars erupted in a blinding burst of light. The rift began to shrink, the dark figure howling as it was pulled back into the portal. Its form twisted, deformed, as it was drawn away, struggling against the pull, but the light from the orb was too strong. The air around them crackled with energy, the force of the rift closing, making the ground shake beneath their feet. Clara's vision blurred as the power coursed through her body trembling with the intensity of it. The dark entity let out one last, blood-curdling scream before it was sucked back into the arch, the portal narrowing, collapsing in on itself. Clara fell to her knees as the last of the dark presence vanished, leaving only silence behind. The oppressive weight that had filled the air was gone. The world felt lighter, as though a great burden had been lifted from it. It was over. Jonah rushed to her side, helping her stand as the glow of the orb slowly faded. "Clara, we did it. We stopped it." Lydia breathed a sigh of relief, her voice shaky with emotion. "We actually did it." Clara could hardly believe it. She looked around at the ruins, now silent, devoid of the menacing energy that had once filled the air. The portal was gone. The darkness was gone. For a moment, everything felt still. The world, it seemed, was at peace again. But Clara knew this wasn't the end. The orb, the symbols, the darkness, they were all pieces of something larger, something they didn't fully understand. She didn't know what would happen next, but she did know that they had stopped it for now. "Thank you," Clara said, her voice trembling as she looked at Jonah and Lydia. "We couldn't have done it without you." Jonah smiled, his face weary but triumphant. "We all did it together." Lydia nodded, a small, relieved smile on her face. "It's over. For now." Clara took a deep breath, looking out over the ruins one last time. The place that had once been a gateway to unimaginable terror was now just a shadow of its former self. And as the last traces of light from the orb faded, she knew that they had a chance to rebuild, to reclaim their world. But even as they stood there, victorious for the moment, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness was still out there, lurking, waiting. The ruins had fallen silent, but the world was vast, and the mysteries of the orb and the portal were far from solved. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew this. They would face whatever came next together.